Hello and welcome. Settle in, get comfortable. Imagine for a moment a truly biting winter wind, the kind faced centuries ago with little more than a smoky fire for comfort. If you find exploring history helps you relax, maybe gently tap that like button or subscribe for more quiet stories. We love knowing where you're listening from. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you, and what time is it? If you find this glimpse into the past fascinating, please hit like, subscribe for more relaxing history deep dives. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now back to the biting cold and clever methods of the medieval winter. When we picture the medieval era, gilded images often come to mind. Knights in shining armor, grand castles, perhaps festive village gatherings. We might imagine merry peasants dancing around a maypole or sharing hearty meals. These snapshots, while perhaps containing kernels of truth for a select few or specific brief moments, are a far cry from the grinding, precarious reality faced by the vast majority of the population, the peasants, who lived subsistence lives tied directly to the land. Their existence was one of constant labor, vulnerability, and often hunger. This romanticized view utterly fails when confronted with the harsh, undeniable truth of one particular season: winter. For the medieval peasant, winter was not merely a shift in weather, a picturesque time of snow-covered landscapes or cozy firesides. It was an existential threat, a brutal, unforgiving gauntlet that had to be survived year after year. It was a season where the margins between life and death shrank alarmingly thin. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a killer. It seeped into flimsy homes, froze meager water sources, and bit at poorly clothed bodies. Food, the hard-won bounty of spring, summer, and autumn, dwindled daily. The energy required just to stay warm and perform necessary chores burned precious calories that were difficult to replace. Think about their homes. Not sturdy, insulated structures built to keep out the deepest chill. Peasant cottages were typically small, often single-room dwellings made of wattle and daub, a mix of mud, clay, and straw plastered over woven branches or sometimes rough stone. Roofs were thatched, offering some insulation but also prone to leaks and drafts. Windows, if they existed at all, were small, unglazed openings, often covered with shutters or perhaps a piece of stretched animal hide or oiled cloth, doing little to keep out the biting wind. Smoke from the central hearth provided some heat, but also filled the air, leading to respiratory problems. Clothing was basic and insufficient by modern standards. Peasants wore simple tunics, possibly layered, made of coarse wool or linen. Leather shoes or boots offered minimal protection from snow and mud. There were no synthetic waterproof fabrics, no down-filled coats, no thermal layers. Staying dry and warm was a constant, difficult battle. Wet clothes could quickly turn deadly in freezing temperatures, leading to hypothermia. Frostbite was a common, debilitating injury, sometimes resulting in the loss of fingers or toes, making essential labor even harder or impossible. Food was the most critical concern. Peasant diets were monotonous and heavily reliant on grain, primarily wheat, rye, or barley, supplemented with legumes like peas and beans, and whatever vegetables they could store, such as root vegetables like parsnips or carrots, if they had space like a root cellar, which wasn't always the case. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps salted or smoked for preservation after an autumn slaughter if an animal could be spared. Dairy products were scarce in winter as cows produced less milk. Fresh food was virtually non-existent. The harvest was everything. A good harvest meant a chance of survival. A poor one meant near-certain starvation for many when the stored food ran out before spring. Winter was the period when these stores were consumed daily. Every mouse, every rat that got into the larder was a thief stealing vital calories. The fear of running out was a constant, gnawing anxiety. By late winter, the hungry gap arrived, when supplies were at their lowest and the new crops were not yet ready. Well, this was often the deadliest time. Illness was rampant in these conditions. Living in close quarters with family and sometimes livestock for warmth meant diseases spread rapidly. Colds and coughs could easily turn into deadly pneumonia or bronchitis, especially when bodies were already weakened by cold and malnutrition. There was little effective medical care available to peasants. Simple infections could become fatal. The very strategies used to stay warm, like huddling together, inadvertently increased the risk of contagion. Death was a frequent visitor to the medieval peasant village, but winter saw its numbers swell dramatically. The very young, the old, and those already weakened by illness or chronic conditions were particularly vulnerable. Infant mortality rates soared during the cold months. A harsh winter could decimate a village population. This wasn't an abstract threat. It was a personal, immediate danger that loomed from the moment the first cold winds began to blow in late autumn. Surviving winter wasn't about comfort. It was about clinging to life itself. Every tactic, every bit of ingenuity employed by the medieval peasant was ultimately aimed at navigating this yearly, brutal struggle against the cold, hunger, and disease. This was the reality, a constant fight for survival in a world utterly unforgiving of weakness or ill preparation. Imagine a landscape blanketed in snow, or perhaps worse, gripped by a relentless, damp cold under gray skies. The wind howls across the fields, searching for any crack, any weakness. For the medieval peasant, their dwelling was the primary shield against this onslaught. Yet it was often a very porous shield indeed. Let's explore the construction of these humble homes and understand just how drafty and cold they truly were. The typical peasant house, often a single-room dwelling, sometimes shared with livestock, especially during the coldest months, was built using materials readily available from the surrounding environment. There were no architects, no detailed blueprints. Construction was based on tradition, necessity, and the limits of local resources. Timber framing formed the basic skeleton. This might involve construction where large curved timbers formed an A-frame reaching from the ground to the roof ridge, or a simpler box frame with upright posts connected by horizontal beams. The wood used was often green, unseasoned, cut locally, meaning it would warp and shift as it dried, opening up gaps over time. These timber frames were not built on stone foundations as we know them. Often the main posts were sunk directly into the earth, perhaps resting on a simple stone pad if the ground was particularly soft or the builder particularly meticulous. This direct contact with the ground invited dampness to seep upwards into the wooden structure, promoting rot over the years. The floor itself, as we will see, was typically nothing more than the beaten earth inside the perimeter of the walls, establishing an immediate connection with the cold ground beneath. There was no subfloor, no basement, just soil. The spaces between the timber framing needed filling to create walls. The most common method throughout much of medieval Europe was wattle and daub. Imagine thin, flexible branches, often hazel or willow, woven horizontally around the upright timber posts or secondary stakes driven into the ground. This created a large, rough matting like a giant, loosely woven basket panel, filling the gaps in the wooden skeleton. The process was laborious, but used readily available materials, the undergrowth and small trees found in nearby woods or hedgerows. This woven lattice was the wattle. Once the wattle panels were in place, the daub was prepared. This was a sticky, structural plaster made from a mixture of wet clay or soil, animal dung, which added binding fibers and ammonia as a preservative, and a tempering material like chopped straw or grass. This gooey concoction was mixed, often by foot, into a thick, pliable paste. It was not a precise science. The exact proportions depended on the local soil quality and available materials. The goal was a substance sticky enough to adhere to the wattle and strong enough to hold together once dry, providing some measure of solidity to the wall. Applying the daub was a messy, hands-on process. The mixture was literally slapped onto both sides of the wattle panel, pushed firmly into the woven branches so that it squeezed through and bonded from both directions. Workers would smooth it out as best they could, using hands or simple wooden floats. The aim was to create a relatively flat surface, covering the entire wattle structure. Embedding the woven branches within the muddy plaster, this layer formed the bulk of the wall's substance, the barrier between the inside of the home and the outside world. It was a primitive but effective way to create solid panels, using little more than mud and sticks. However, as this thick layer of daub dried, problems inherent in the material would emerge. Depending on the weather and the consistency of the mix, it could take weeks to dry fully. During this process, shrinkage was inevitable. The daub would pull away slightly from the timber frame and fine cracks, sometimes even larger fissures, would appear throughout the surface. These cracks and gaps were pathways for the wind and cold. Annual maintenance was required, re-smearing patches with fresh daub, but it was a constant battle against the elements and the inherent imperfections of the materials used. The resulting wattle and daub walls were relatively thin compared to modern construction. They offered minimal insulation value. Think of it less as a barrier to temperature and more as a barrier to wind and rain, and even then not a perfect one. There was no cavity wall, no insulation layer, just the timber frame and the dried mud and straw mixture. Cold radiated easily through the material, and the numerous small cracks and gaps around the timbers allowed drafts to sneak in persistently. On a windy winter day, the chill could be felt directly through these walls. The roof was another critical element, primarily designed to keep out the rain and snow. The structure itself was simple, timber rafters resting on the wall plates and meeting at a central ridgepole or beam. Across these rafters, thinner pieces of wood, called laths, might be laid horizontally. This framework provided the support for the final roof covering. Like the walls, the roof structure used locally sourced timber, often unseasoned, subject to warping and movement over time, which could affect the integrity of the roof covering placed upon it. The most common roofing material for peasant homes was thatch. This involved layering bundles of dried vegetation, usually straw from grain crops, but sometimes reeds or heather depending on local availability, onto the roof laths, starting from the eaves and working upwards towards the ridge. Each layer overlapped the one below, creating a thick mat designed to shed water effectively. Skilled thatchers could create a roof that was remarkably watertight, channeling rain down and away from the walls below. The thickness could vary, but several inches of compressed thatch was typical. While reasonably effective at shedding water when well maintained, thatch offered surprisingly poor insulation against the cold air of winter. Its primary function was rain protection. Air could still filter through the densely packed stems, especially when winds were strong. Furthermore, thatch required regular maintenance. It was susceptible to rot, particularly near the ridge and eaves, could be damaged by wind, and provided an attractive home for birds, rodents, and insects. It was also, of course, highly flammable, a constant danger in dwellings where the main source of heat and light was an open fire. Windows, as we conceive of them, were a luxury far beyond the reach of the average peasant. Glass was prohibitively expensive. Peasant homes often had few openings in the walls beyond the door, perhaps just one or two small apertures, designed more for ventilation in summer than for light or viewing. These openings might be simple, rectangular holes cut between studs. Their small size helped minimize heat loss, but also meant the interior of the house was perpetually dim, especially during the short, overcast days of winter. Light inside would have been minimal. To cover these small window openings during harsh weather, peasants used whatever they could. Sometimes, simple wooden shutters, crudely fashioned from planks, could be closed from the inside or outside. These rarely fitted snugly, leaving gaps around the edges for drafts. Alternatively, pieces of cloth, animal hide, or even tightly bundled straw might be stuffed into the opening. None of these offered a perfect seal against the biting wind or driving snow. Often the choice was between plunging the interior into near-total darkness or enduring a constant stream of frigid air. Beneath one's feet lay not wooden floorboards or stone flags, but the earth itself. The floor of a peasant house was typically compacted soil, perhaps mixed with clay to create a harder surface. This floor was perpetually cold, drawing the chill directly from the frozen ground outside. It was also prone to dampness, especially in wet weather, or if the ground outside sloped towards the house. Water could seep in, turning patches of the floor into mud. This cold, damp surface was a major source of discomfort and contributed significantly to the overall chill within the dwelling. To mitigate the cold and dampness of the earth floor, peasants would often cover it with layers of straw or rushes. These materials provided a small measure of insulation and absorbed some moisture, making the floor slightly more comfortable to walk and sit on. However, this flooring was temporary. It became soiled quickly with mud, food scraps, animal waste, if animals were kept inside, and general debris. It needed to be swept out and replaced periodically, but it harbored dirt and pests, contributing to the often unsanitary conditions inside the home. The door was another weak point in the defense against winter. It was usually made of rough wooden planks, perhaps held together with cross brasses. Leather hinges or simple wooden pivots allowed it to swing open. Like the window shutters, the door rarely fitted its frame perfectly. Gaps around the edges and beneath the door were common, allowing icy drafts and even driven snow to enter the house. A simple latch or wooden bar secured it from the inside, offering security but little protection against the pervasive cold that seeped through the cracks. Imagine standing inside such a dwelling on a deep winter's day. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central hearth, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and perhaps livestock. Light is minimal, filtering dimly through the small window openings or the open doorway, but most pervasive is the cold. Not just a general coolness, but palpable drafts swirling around your ankles from beneath the ill-fitting door, cold air radiating from the thin wattle and daub walls, and a constant chill rising from the damp earth floor. There were likely colder spots near the walls and openings, forcing inhabitants to huddle closer to the central fire. Living in such a home during winter was an exercise in endurance. The structure offered basic shelter from precipitation and the worst of the wind, but it was far from a warm or comfortable refuge. The cold was a constant companion indoors. Drafts were unavoidable. The dampness seemed to cling to everything. Attempts to seal gaps with rags or extra daub were temporary fixes at best. The very fabric of the peasant home, the earth floor, the thin walls, the simple roof, the basic openings, conspired to let the winter chill permeate the living space almost entirely. This constant exposure to cold and damp had significant implications for health and survival. Staying warm required huddling near the fire, sharing body heat with family members and sometimes animals, and wearing thick, coarse woolen clothing indoors. The structure itself provided only the most rudimentary barrier. The medieval peasant dwelling, the humble and drafty home, stands as a testament to the resilience required to simply survive the brutal indifference of a medieval winter, where the cold outside was almost mirrored by the pervasive chill within. Let us now turn our attention downwards to the very ground upon which the medieval peasant lived and slept. In our previous explorations of the humble dwelling, we touched upon the basic structure, the drafty walls, the simple roof. But the battle against the winter cold was also waged vertically, from the earth itself. Tonight, we delve into the reality of the compacted dirt floor and the rudimentary sleeping arrangements that offered scant comfort against the pervasive chill seeping up from below. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and picture the cold reality beneath the peasant's feet. The floor was nearly inconvenient within the typical peasant home, was rarely more than the native earth, leveled and compacted through constant use. Sometimes clay might be mixed in and tamped down while wet to create a harder, more durable surface. There was no concept of a foundation in the modern sense, no damp-proof course, no barrier between the living space and the cold, often wet, ground beneath. The floor was simply the earth, enclosed by the thin walls of the hut. This direct connection was the source of a constant, insidious cold, fundamentally different from the drafts that slipped through walls or roofs. Imagine the feeling of that earth floor during the depths of winter. Even when the ground outside wasn't frozen solid, it held a deep, penetrating chill. The thermal mass of the earth acted like a constant sink, drawing warmth away from the air inside the dwelling and away from anything or anyone in contact with it. Walking barefoot or even in simple leather turn shoes would have been a perpetually cold experience. The floor radiated cold upwards, contributing significantly to the low ambient temperature within the single room, making true warmth an elusive luxury. This direct contact with the ground meant there was absolutely no insulation underfoot. Unlike the walls, which offered at least a minimal barrier to wind, the floor offered no resistance to the temperature of the earth itself. Heat generated by the central hearth or by the bodies of the inhabitants would be drawn downwards into the cold ground. It was an unending thermal drain. This constant loss of heat made warming the small space incredibly inefficient and meant that even near the fire, one's feet might remain stubbornly cold, chilled by the proximity to the packed earth beneath. Compounding the issue of cold was the persistent problem of dampness. Soil naturally holds moisture, and without any barrier, this dampness would wick upwards into the compacted earth floor. During wet weather, periods of thaw, or if the ground outside sloped towards the dwelling, the floor could become actively wet, even muddy in places. This dampness not only made the floor colder, as damp materials conduct heat away more readily, but also contributed to a generally clammy, unhealthy atmosphere within the home. The smell of damp earth would have been a constant presence. Try to sense the physical reality, the unyielding hardness of the packed earth beneath your feet, never truly warming. Feel the persistent chill radiating upwards, a cold that felt different from the moving air of a draft, a still, deep coldness. Notice the areas where a moisture has seeped through, making the surface slick or slightly soft, enhancing the cold sensation and perhaps carrying the earthy smell more strongly. It was a surface that offered no comfort, only the basic utility of separating the inside from the truly exposed ground outside, and even that separation was minimal in thermal terms. To make these cold, damp floors marginally more habitable, peasants relied on strewn floor coverings. The most common materials were straw, the dried stalks left after grain harvesting, or rushes, gathered from marshy areas. These materials were readily available and cost little or nothing beyond the labor of gathering and spreading them. Layers of straw or rushes were laid down across the earth floor, creating a matting of organic material. This was the medieval equivalent of carpeting, though far removed in comfort and cleanliness. The primary purpose of these coverings was twofold. Firstly, they provided a small degree of insulation, trapping tiny pockets of air and creating a slight buffer between feet or bodies and the cold earth. Secondly, they absorbed some of the surface moisture and provided a cleaner, drier layer to walk or sit upon. At least initially, it made the floor feel slightly less hard and cold, a small but significant improvement in perceived comfort within the harsh realities of the peasant home during winter. It was an attempt to soften the hard edge of their environment. Spreading the rushes or straw was a simple task. Bundles were brought in and shaken out across the floor, often layered to create a thicker covering. In some depictions or descriptions, there's a sense of seasonal renewal, perhaps with fresh rushes laid for particular feasts or occasions. However, For everyday life, the covering was likely added to incrementally rather than fully replaced frequently. The goal was to maintain a usable layer that kept inhabitants slightly elevated from the bare, cold earth. However, the effectiveness of straw and rushes as insulation was limited and temporary. Foot traffic quickly compressed the materials, squeezing out the trapped air pockets that provided the insulating effect. The lower layers, in direct contact with the damp earth, would absorb moisture and begin to decompose. What started as a fresh, somewhat springy layer would soon become a flattened, soiled, and damp mat, offering little thermal benefit against the persistent cold from the ground. Its insulating properties degraded rapidly with use. Furthermore, these organic floor coverings became repositories for all manner of debris. Mud tracked in from outside, spilled food and drink, animal waste if livestock shared the space, ashes from the fire, hair, insects, all became embedded in the straw or rushes. This created an unsanitary environment, fostering bacteria, mold, and attracting pests like mice, rats, and fleas. The coverings that offered a modicum of comfort also contributed to the unhygienic conditions prevalent in many medieval peasant homes. Because they became soiled and compressed so quickly, the floor coverings needed attention. Ideally, the old, dirty layer would be swept out periodically and replaced with fresh material. However, the frequency of this cleaning varied greatly depending on the household, the season, and the availability of fresh straw or rushes. In some cases, fresh layers might simply be added on top of the old, creating a dense, stratified mat of decomposing organic matter mixed with accumulated filth, inches thick in some instances. Now, let us consider where the peasants slept amidst this cold environment. Beds, as we know them, were uncommon. Often, sleep occurred simply on a designated area of the floor, perhaps slightly raised or partitioned, or directly upon the rush-covered earth. If a specific bed structure existed, it was typically rudimentary. A low wooden frame, perhaps just planks, laid directly on the floor, creating a shallow box to contain the bedding material and lift the sleepers slightly away from the worst of the floor-level drafts and dampness. The mattress itself was usually a large sack, often made of coarse canvas or burlap, stuffed with whatever filling material was available. Straw was very common, providing some minimal padding. Dried leaves, bracken, a type of fern, or even scraps of wool might also be used. This stuffed sack, known as a palliasse, was laid upon the floor or within the simple bed frame. It offered a slight cushioning effect compared to the bare earth or rushes, but the insulation it provided was meager, especially once compressed by the weight of bodies. Imagine settling down on such a bed. The straw filling rustles beneath you. It conforms slightly to your body but feels lumpy and uneven. Through the coarse sacking and the compressed straw, you can still feel the hardness of the earth floor beneath. And more importantly, you can feel the cold. The straw, easily flattened, provides very little loft to trap warm air. Sleeping on a palliasse meant sleeping in close proximity to the cold source of the earth floor, with only a thin, inefficient layer of organic material in between. The minimal insulation offered by the straw mattress and the underlying floor coverings meant that staying warm through the night was a significant challenge. Body heat would be constantly wicked away by the cold floor below. This is one reason why families often slept huddled together, sharing body heat for communal warmth. Sometimes, as mentioned, animals might even be brought inside during the coldest spells, not just for their own protection, but also because their body heat contributed, however slightly and smellily, to warming the interior space. Sleeping arrangements were therefore directly impacted by the cold floor. Huddling together wasn't just companionable, it was a survival tactic. Blankets, if available, would likely be coarse wool or animal hides, providing some top-layer insulation, but the cold, attacking from below through the inadequate mattress and floor, remained a constant drain on body heat. The peasant bed offered little sanctuary from the fundamental coldness emanating from the ground. Ultimately, both the rush or straw floor coverings and the basic straw-filled beds were rudimentary coping mechanisms rather than effective solutions. They represented the peasants' attempt to mitigate the harshness of their environment using the limited materials available. They slightly reduced the immediate shock of the cold, damp earth, but they could not truly insulate against it. The cold from the ground remained a dominant feature of the indoor winter experience. Consider the psychological effect of this constant battle against the cold from below. Even indoors, even in bed, the chill of the earth was never far away. It was a tangible reminder of the precariousness of existence, of the minimal protection offered by the dwelling. This feeling of dampness underfoot, the persistent cold radiating upwards, even through layers of straw, would have contributed to a sense of pervasive discomfort, making true rest difficult and emphasizing the vulnerability of the human body against the elements. In conclusion, the packed earth floor of the medieval peasant home was a major source of cold and damp during the winter months. The simple expedient of covering it with straw or rushes and sleeping upon straw-filled palliasses offered only the most basic level of comfort and insulation. Battling the cold that seeped up from the ground was a fundamental part of the winter struggle for survival, fought with meager resources on the very surface where life unfolded and rest was sought. The floor and bed were not escapes from the cold, but merely interfaces with its persistent presence. Let us gather now, in our minds, within the dim confines of the medieval peasant dwelling during the long, cold winter months. We've felt the chills seeping from the earth floor, the drafts whispering through the thin walls. Tonight we turn our focus to the single element that stood against the pervasive cold and darkness, the hearth. It was more than just a fireplace. It was the undeniable center of domestic life, the source of warmth, the only reliable light after sunset, and the place where meager meals were prepared. Yet, this vital heart often beat with a smoky, demanding rhythm. Settle deeper, breathe evenly, and let the image of the smoky hearth fill your thoughts. Unlike the grand fireplaces built into the stone walls of castles or manor houses, the peasant hearth was typically a far simpler affair. In many earlier basic dwellings, it wasn't a structure at all, but merely a designated area, often positioned centrally on the compacted earth floor. This central location allowed heat to radiate outwards more evenly, albeit inefficiently, into the single room that usually comprised the entire home. It also kept the flames further away from the combustible walls, though fire risk remained a constant concern we shall touch upon later. The construction, if any, was rudimentary. Perhaps a ring of stones was gathered to contain the burning fuel and embers, offering a slight visual demarcation and a minimal barrier. In other cases, a shallow depression might be scooped out of the earth floor, or a slightly raised platform of packed clay might be built up over time. There was no ornate mantelpiece, no complex flue system. It was functional, basic, and positioned directly on the cold ground we explored previously, a small island of heat in a sea of chill. Fueling this essential fire required constant effort and depended heavily on local resources. Wood was the most common fuel where available, gathered from nearby forests or common lands, often involving rites and restrictions. Peasants typically gathered fallen branches or coppiced wood rather than felling large trees. In areas lacking abundant woodland, dried peat cut from bogs or even dried animal dung collected from the fields would be burned. Securing enough fuel to keep the hearth going through a long winter was a significant time-consuming task, adding another layer to the struggle for survival. The hearth's most crucial function in winter was providing warmth. In a structure with minimal insulation and constant drafts, the fire was the only significant source of heat, countering the biting cold. It offered a focal point of relative comfort, a place to thaw frozen fingers and toes after working outside, or simply enduring the chill within the hut. Without the hearth, the peasant home in winter would have been almost unbearably cold, little better than an open-sided shelter against the elements. The fire made endurance possible. However, the heat provided by an open hearth was localized and inefficient. Warmth radiated outwards, but its effect diminished rapidly with distance. To benefit, family members would need to huddle close to the flames, almost within the ring of stones. This created a small bubble of warmth, while the corners of the room, the areas near the walls and door, remained significantly colder. The temperature within the single-room dwelling was far from uniform, forcing occupants to cluster together near the fire's glow for any real comfort. Beyond warmth, the hearth served as the primary and often only source of light after the sun went down or during the long, overcast days of winter. Candles were a luxury, expensive, and quickly consumed. Rushes dipped in fat, offered a feeble, flickering light, but the steady glow and dancing flames of the hearth fire provided the most reliable illumination for indoor activities after dark, such as mending tools, spinning wool, or preparing the next day's meager meal. The fire pushed back the profound darkness of the rural medieval nights. The quality of this light, however, was far removed from modern illumination. It was a dynamic, flickering light, casting deep and shifting shadows across the rough walls and the faces gathered around. It illuminated the immediate area around the hearth relatively well, but left the periphery of the room in deep gloom. Reading, had the peasant been literate and possessed books, would have been difficult. Fine craftwork was challenging. The light was sufficient for basic tasks and social interaction, but it contributed to an atmosphere that felt enclosed and mysterious after dark. Crucially, the hearth was also the kitchen. All cooking took place over the open flames, or glowing embers. A simple iron pot, perhaps suspended from a hook attached to a roof beam or balanced on a tripod, directly in the fire would be used for boiling grains, vegetables, or simmering thin stews. Bread might be baked in the hot ashes or on a heated flat stone placed near the embers. Meat, a rare treat, could be roasted on a spit. The hearth was the engine of sustenance, transforming raw ingredients into the meals that fueled the family's labor and survival. Now we must address the hearth's most significant drawback, the smoke. In the vast majority of simple peasant dwellings, especially in earlier medieval periods, there were no chimneys as we know them. A chimney with a dedicated flue drawing smoke up and out of the building was a later development and often a feature of wealthier homes. Without a chimney, the smoke generated by the constantly burning fire had nowhere to go but up into the living space. Attempts were made to allow smoke to escape, but they were generally inadequate. Often a simple hole might be left open in the thatch or wooden roof, directly above the hearth. Sometimes vents or gaps were intentionally left near the roof's peak in the gable ends. The idea was that the rising hot smoke would find its way out through these openings. However, this natural venting process was highly inefficient and heavily depended on weather conditions. It was a passive system with limited draw. The reality was that these simple smoke holes or vents were often insufficient to handle the volume of smoke produced by a wood, peat, or dung fire, especially when fuel was damp or the fire was first lit. Wind blown across the roof could interfere with the upward draft, sometimes even pushing smoke back down into the dwelling. Consequently, the upper levels of the single-room house were perpetually filled with a thick layer of smoke, while even at lower levels the air remained hazy and acrid. Imagine the atmosphere inside. A constant haze of wood smoke hangs in the air, thickest near the roof timbers but pervasive throughout. It stings the eyes, making them water. It irritates the throat and lungs, provoking coughs. The smell of smoke permeates everything: clothing, bedding, hair, food. While humans can adapt to some extent, the constant exposure to high levels of particulate matter and carbon monoxide from the inefficiently vented fire was unavoidable. It was simply the accepted condition of being indoors near the vital fire. This chronic exposure to wood smoke undoubtedly had long-term health consequences. Respiratory ailments, chronic bronchitis, eye infections, and potentially increased risks of cancer were likely common issues exacerbated by living in smoke-filled interiors. Archaeological evidence examining skeletal remains sometimes shows signs of respiratory stress that could be linked to such living condition. The life-giving hearth simultaneously posed a chronic threat to the health of those who depended upon it for survival through the winter. The pervasive smoke left its mark physically on the interior of the dwelling. Everything above hearth level, especially the underside of the thatched roof and the supporting timbers, would become coated in a thick, black, greasy layer of soot. This soot further darkened the already dim interior and could flake off, dirtying anything below. Walls, rudimentary furniture, stored items, everything accumulated a film of grime over time. Creaming was a constant battle against the airborne residue of the essential fire. Keeping the hearth fire alive required continuous attention. Fuel needed to be added regularly throughout the day to maintain warmth and provide embers for cooking. During the coldest parts of winter, allowing the fire to die out completely was unthinkable, as restarting it, especially with primitive methods like flint and steel, could be difficult and time-consuming. Someone, usually the woman of the house, would be responsible for tending the fire, ensuring it didn't burn too high or dwindle too low. It was a constant background task woven into the fabric of daily life. At night, the fire would be carefully banked. This involved covering the glowing embers with ashes to reduce the oxygen supply, allowing them to smolder slowly overnight without consuming too much fuel or bursting back into flame. In the morning, the ashes would be carefully raked away, fresh kindling added, and the embers hopefully coaxed back to life, with gentle blowing or bellows if available. Successfully banking the fire saved precious fuel and the effort of starting anew each cold morning. Despite its necessity, the open hearth posed a significant fire hazard. Sparks could easily jump out onto the dry straw or rush floor coverings, or onto bedding materials if people slept too close. An unattended pot boiling over could scatter embers. Most dangerously, sparks rising with the smoke could potentially ignite the underside of the dried thatch roof. House fires were a real and devastating danger in medieval villages, capable of destroying not just one home, but spreading rapidly through closely built timber and thatch structures. Despite the smoke, the danger, and the constant work it demanded, the hearth was the undisputed social center of the peasant home. In the evenings or during breaks from labor, the family would gather around its warmth and light. Stories might be told, simple songs sung, tools mended, or future tasks discussed. It was the focal point for communal activity, the place where the family unit came together against the darkness and cold outside. Its physical centrality mirrored its social centrality. Beyond its practical functions, the hearth held deep psychological importance. It represented security, warmth, sustenance, and continuity. The sight and sound of the crackling fire, the smell of wood smoke, despite its downsides, the feeling of warmth on one's skin, These were fundamental sensory experiences associated with home and survival. In the bleakness of winter, the glowing hearth was a powerful symbol of life and endurance, a small beacon against the overwhelming power of the natural world. In summing up, the peasant hearth was a profoundly ambivalent element of medieval life. It was utterly essential for survival through winter, providing the heat, light, and cooking facilities that made life possible within the drafty basic structure of the home. Yet, its inefficiency, lack of proper ventilation, and constant demands made it a source of discomfort, potential illness, and danger. This smoky, vital, demanding heart of the home encapsulates the harsh compromises and resilient strategies inherent in the daily existence of the medieval peasant. As darkness enveloped the medieval landscape and the peasant family huddled near the dwindling warmth of the central hearth, one final, crucial task remained before sleep could be sought. The fire, that vital heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook, could not simply be allowed to die out overnight. To do so would invite a cold and difficult start to the demanding day ahead. Tonight, let us explore the quiet, careful ritual of banking the fire, a small but essential act of skill and foresight passed down through generations. Let your mind settle on this nightly process, a rhythm of survival in the face of the long winter night. The core problem was simple yet profound, ensuring there was fire in the morning without consuming excessive fuel overnight, and without the convenience of modern ignition methods. In our world, starting a fire is trivial, a match, a lighter, but for the medieval peasant, conjuring flame from nothing was a laborious process. Allowing the precious hearth fire to extinguish completely meant facing this challenge anew in the cold, dark morning, a significant expenditure of time and effort when both were in short supply. Preservation was key. Imagine a world without matches. Consider the effort involved in the primary methods of fire starting available then. Flint struck against steel, showering sparks onto tinder, dry fungus, charred cloth, or fine plant down, hoping one spark would catch and gently ignite the tinder, which could then be transferred to kindling. Or picture the fire drill, rapidly rotating a wooden spindle against a fireboard to generate heat through friction, eventually creating a glowing ember in the wood dust. Both methods required skill, patience, specific materials, and, crucially, dry conditions not always guaranteed in a damp winter hut. Therefore, the preferred method by far was not to create fire daily, but to preserve it. Banking the fire was the technique used to keep embers alive overnight, ready to be coaxed back into flame come morning. It was a practice born of necessity, a fundamental skill for managing the hearth efficiently and ensuring the continuity of warmth and the ability to cook without undue delay. It transformed the hearth from a temporary source of comfort into a continuously available resource, albeit one requiring careful management. The principle behind banking the fire is straightforward: control the oxygen supply. Fire needs fuel, heat, and oxygen to burn. By carefully restricting the amount of air reaching the glowing embers, the rate of combustion could be slowed dramatically. Instead of burning relatively quickly into ash, the embers would smolder at a very low level, conserving their heat and substance for many hours. The goal was not to extinguish the fire, but to put it into a state of suspended animation, ready to be revived. The perfect medium for this process was readily available in the hearth itself: ash. Wood ash, the fine, powdery residue left from burnt fuel, possesses excellent insulating properties. It doesn't burn, and its fine texture allows it to pack closely around embers, effectively sealing them off from the surrounding air. A thick layer of ash could keep embers glowing faintly for 8, 10, even 12 hours, bridging the gap between the evening's last tasks and the morning's first needs. Ash was the key ingredient in this nightly preservation. The process of banking the fire began as the evening drew to a close and the flames started to die down. The person tending the fire, often the woman of the house, would carefully select the best embers. These were the pieces of wood or other fuel that had burned down to solid, brightly glowing coals, holding heat effectively. Smaller, crumbling embers or pieces still actively flaming were less suitable. A small collection of the most promising, long-lasting embers was gathered towards the center of the hearth, forming the core to be preserved. Next, the substantial amount of ash accumulated from previous fires would be used. A thick bed of cool ash might be prepared in the hearth. Alternatively, ash would be mounded up around the chosen embers. The key was to have enough ash readily at hand to completely envelop the glowing coals. This wasn't just a light sprinkling, it required a generous quantity to ensure adequate insulation and oxygen restriction. Fine gray powder was carefully manipulated, perhaps using a simple stick or piece of wood. Then came the most critical step: carefully covering the gathered embers with the ash. This had to be done meticulously. The ash was gently pushed, scooped, or piled over the embers, ensuring they were completely buried within a thick layer. Care was taken not to pack the ash too tightly, which might suffocate the embers entirely, nor too loosely, which might allow too much air in, causing them to burn out too quickly. It was a delicate balance, learned through experience. The aim was to create a sealed, insulating mound. The objective was to achieve a state of slow, almost imperceptible smoldering. Seen from above, the banked fire would appear as just a mound of gray ash, perhaps with a faint warmth radiating from it, but with no visible glow or smoke. Beneath the surface, however, the embers remained alive, consuming oxygen at a minimal rate, their internal heat preserved by the insulating blanket of ash. They were dormant, waiting for the conditions to change, waiting for the morning's intervention. This banking of the fire was not an occasional task, but a nightly ritual, performed with practiced care every single evening, especially during the cold months. It was as routine as fetching water or preparing food. The responsibility often fell to the mistress of the household, whose domain included the hearth and its management. It was a quiet, focused task undertaken in the dim light of the dying fire, a final act of stewardship before the household settled into sleep, entrusting their morning warmth to the buried embers. The moment of truth arrived with the dawn. In the cold morning air, the banked mound of ash would be approached with anticipation. Using a stick or hands, the ash covering would be carefully scraped away. The hope was to reveal embers still glowing, perhaps faintly red or orange, nestled within the gray powder. Finding these live coals was a small but significant victory, a confirmation that the banking had been successful and the day could begin with the essential element of fire readily available. Once uncovered, the revived embers needed encouragement. Fine, dry tinder, perhaps dried moss, birch bark shavings, or frayed fibers would be placed gently against the glowing coals. Then the tender process of blowing began. Gentle, steady breaths directed at the embers would increase the oxygen supply, causing the glow to intensify. The tinder would begin to smoke, then hopefully catch, producing a tiny flame. This nascent flame was then carefully fed with small twigs or splinters of wood, gradually building it back into a proper fire. Success in banking the fire meant the household could quickly have warmth against the morning chill. Water could be heated, a simple breakfast prepared, and the daily routines could commence without the significant delay and effort of starting a fire from scratch. It represented continuity, efficiency, and a mastery over one of the most fundamental elements of survival. The sight of the newly kindled flames spreading through the kindling was a reassuring start to the day. But failure was always a possibility. If the ash was packed too tightly, or if the initial embers were too small or weak, they might be completely extinguished overnight. Uncovering the banked mound only to find cold, dead ashes was a disheartening setback. It meant resorting to the laborious process of using flint and steel or a fire drill, or perhaps facing the slight indignity of taking a pot or shovel to a neighbor's hearth to borrow some live coals, assuming their banking had been successful. Conversely, there was also the risk of banking the fire improperly, allowing too much air to reach the embers. This could cause them to continue burning too actively overnight, consuming themselves entirely before morning. Worse still, if banked carelessly near flammable materials, or if a draft somehow reached the embers, they could potentially flare up during the night, potentially igniting floor coverings or even the structure itself. An improperly banked fire, intended for preservation, could become a source of disaster. Therefore, banking the fire was truly an art, requiring judgment and experience. The tender needed to know their specific hearth, the qualities of the fuel being burned, different woods produce different types of embers and ash, and how much ash to use. They needed to gauge the strength of the embers, the ambient temperature, and even anticipate potential drafts. But it wasn't an automatic process, but one requiring mindful attention and adjustment based on conditions. Imagine the sensory details of this quiet ritual, the soft gray texture of the ash, cool to the touch away from the center, the faint, deep red glow of the chosen embers before they are covered, the near silence of the task, perhaps broken only by the gentle scrape of wood on ash or the soft breathing of the tender, the focused concentration required to ensure the embers are perfectly buried, sealed away from the night air. It was a moment of quiet connection between the human and the essential element of fire. Psychologically, banking the fire was an act of faith and foresight. It was an investment made each night towards the comfort and survival of the following day. It represented a trust in one's own skill and knowledge, and in the predictability of the natural process of slow combustion. Successfully reviving the fire each morning reinforced a sense of control, however small, over the challenging environment. It linked the end of one day seamlessly to the beginning of the next, through the unbroken chain of fire. In conclusion, The seemingly simple act of banking the hearth fire overnight was a critical survival skill for the medieval peasant. Born from the lack of easy ignition methods, it was a nightly ritual requiring care, judgment, and an intimate understanding of fire and ash. It balanced the need to preserve precious embers against the risks of extinguishment or accidental flare-up. The vast quiet art, performed faithfully each evening, ensured the continuity of warmth, light, and sustenance, forming a vital, rhythmic pulse at the very heart of medieval peasant life through the long, dark winters. Having considered the peasant's dwelling and the central hearth, let us now turn our attention to the individual's immediate protection against the winter chill: their clothing. In an era long before synthetic fibers and technical outerwear, the medieval peasant relied on natural materials and simple strategies to fend off the cold, wind, and damp. Tonight, we explore the rough garments they wore, the crucial tactic of layering, and an often overlooked, perhaps surprising, aspect of their winter attire: the role of accumulated dirt and grease. Settle in, breathe deeply, and imagine wrapping yourself in the reality of medieval peasant clothing. The undisputed king of fabrics for peasant clothing, especially in cooler European climates, was wool. Sheep were ubiquitous in the medieval landscape, providing not only meat and milk, but also this essential fiber. Wool possesses remarkable properties that made it ideal for basic clothing. It offers excellent insulation, trapping air within its fibers. Crucially, it retains a significant degree of its insulating ability even when damp, unlike plant fibers such as linen or cotton, which feel cold and clammy when wet. This was vital in often damp, drizzly winters. Transforming raw fleece into usable cloth was a laborious multi-stage process, typically carried out within the peasant household or village community. After shearing the sheep, the wool had to be cleaned, although often imperfectly, removing the worst of the dirt, twigs, and lanolin, the natural grease. Then came carding or combing to align the fibers, followed by spinning using a simple drop spindle, or later, a spinning wheel, to twist the fibers into yarn. This homespun yarn was often thick, uneven, and coarse compared to modern machine-spun threads. This yarn was then woven into cloth, usually on a simple vertical or horizontal loom within the home or by a village weaver. The resulting fabric was typically a tabby weave, a basic over and under pattern, creating a textile that was functional and durable, but often rough and scratchy to the touch. It lacked the refinement and softness of fabrics available to the wealthy. The priority was durability and warmth over comfort against the skin. This rough-spun, rough-woven wool formed the basis of most peasant garments. The colors of peasant clothing were generally muted and drab, reflecting the natural shades of sheep's wool: creams, grays, browns, and blacks. Dyeing required additional resources and effort, while simple plant-based dyes using locally available materials like woad blue, weld yellow, or madder red might be used occasionally. Brightly colored or intricately patterned fabrics were typically beyond the means of the average peasant. Most clothing likely remained in its natural, undyed state, blending into the earthy tones of the landscape. The cornerstone garment for both men and women was the tunic. At its most basic, this was a simple T-shaped garment, often made from one or two pieces of cloth sewn together with holes for the head and arms. Tunics varied in length, typically knee length or longer for men and often ankle length for women. They were loose-fitting, allowing for ease of movement during labor. Made from the standard coarse wool, the tunic was the fundamental layer, worn day in, day out. Its simplicity reflected the limited resources and tailoring skills available. Beneath the outer wool tunic, some peasants, particularly if slightly better off, might wear an undertunic or shift made of linen. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was softer against the skin than coarse wool but provided less warmth and felt cold when wet. For many poorer peasants, the wool tunic might be worn directly against the skin, accepting the scratchiness as normal. Men might also wear simple linen or wool breeches, loose-fitting trousers tied at the waist under their tunics. These underlayers were also basic in construction. For the lower body, men commonly wore hose, which were essentially long stockings covering the legs, sometimes with feet included, sometimes ending at the ankle. These were typically made of woven wool, sometimes cut on the bias for a slightly better fit, and held up by being tied to the breeches or a belt around the waist. Women's legs were generally covered by their long tunics or dresses, but they might also wear simple stockings for warmth. Leg coverings were essential for protecting against the cold that emanated from the ground and drafts swirling at floor level. The primary strategy for staying warm in winter was layering. Since individual garments offered limited insulation, peasants would simply wear multiple layers of clothing simultaneously. It was common to wear 2 or even 3 tunics, one over the other, especially during the coldest weather or when working outdoors. This trapped air between the layers of wool, significantly enhancing the overall thermal protection. The peasant in winter essentially became a human onion wrapped in multiple layers of rough fabric. Over the top of these layered tunics, a cloak or mantle was an essential piece of outerwear. This was often a simple rectangle or semicircle of heavier wool cloth, sometimes with a hood attached. It could be fastened at the neck with a simple pin or tie. The cloak provided an extra layer of insulation and, crucially, offered protection against wind, rain, and snow. It could be wrapped tightly around the body for warmth or worn looser during physical activity. The cloak was the peasant's main shield against the elements when outdoors. Hoods were also vital for preventing heat loss from the head and neck. As mentioned, they were often attached directly to the cloak, forming a single garment. Separate hoods covering the head and extending down over the shoulders like a short cowl or capelet were also common. Made of wool, the hood protected against biting winds and precipitation, conserving precious body heat. Covering the head was a simple but effective way to stay warmer in cold conditions. Footwear was basic and offered limited protection. Simple shoes, often made using the turn shoe method where the leather was sewn together inside out and then turned, were common. These were essentially leather socks with a slightly tougher sole. They provided minimal insulation and were not waterproof. To add warmth and absorb moisture, peasants might stuff their shoes with dry moss, straw, or scraps of cloth. Keeping feet warm and dry was a constant challenge in the cold, damp conditions of winter. An important factor influencing peasant clothing was the sheer lack of quantity. Most peasants owned very few sets of clothes, perhaps only one or two complete outfits. Garments were worn repeatedly, day after day, week after week, until they literally wore out. Patches were applied to extend the life of clothing as much as possible. Having a change of clothes, as we understand it, was often not an option. The same layers were worn for work, for rest, and often for sleep. Consequently, washing clothes was an infrequent event. It required access to water, fuel to heat it, if desired, something to act as a cleaning agent, like lye derived from wood ash, which was harsh on fabrics, and, significantly, time and labor that peasants often couldn't spare from essential tasks like farming or tending livestock. Furthermore, washing wool incorrectly could cause it to shrink or felt. As a result, clothes were often worn for extended periods between washings, allowing grime to accumulate. This constant wear and infrequent washing led to a significant buildup of dirt, sweat, and natural body oils within the fibers of the wool garments. The lanolin naturally present in wool already provides some water resistance, but this effect would be amplified by the accumulated grease and grime from human bodies, cooking smoke, and everyday activities. Layer upon layer of this organic material became embedded deep within the weave of the fabric over time. Now we arrive at the perhaps surprising aspect. This accumulation of dirt and grease, while unhygienic by modern standards, may have inadvertently served a practical purpose in winter. The buildup effectively filled the tiny air gaps within the coarse weave of the homespun wool. This reduced the fabric's permeability to air, meaning cold winds couldn't penetrate the layers as easily. The grime essentially acted as a filler, making the fabric denser and more wind-resistant. Furthermore, the greasy buildup likely enhanced the wool's natural water resistance. Just as lanolin helps sheep shed water, the accumulated human oils and environmental grease would have created a more water-repellent surface on the clothing. Light rain or damp snow might beat up and run off more effectively than it would from cleaner, drier wool. This unintentional weatherproofing could have offered a marginal but valuable benefit in damp winter conditions, helping the wearer stay slightly drier and therefore warmer. Of course, the downsides to this built-in grime were significant. The clothes would have been stiff, heavy, and undoubtedly smelled strongly. They would have harbored bacteria and potentially parasites like lice or fleas, contributing to the prevalence of skin complaints and disease. While offering some minor physical benefits in terms of insulation and water resistance, the lack of cleanliness posed considerable health risks. It is a trade-off dictated by circumstance, not choice. It's also crucial to remember that medieval standards of hygiene and smell were vastly different from our own. In a world without regular bathing, effective soaps, or deodorants, the odors emanating from unwashed bodies and clothes were simply a normal part of life. The smell of stale sweat, wood smoke, grease, and damp wool would have been ubiquitous. The insulating layer of grime wouldn't have been perceived with the same revulsion it might evoke today. It was simply the state of peasant clothing. So, the medieval peasant faced winter wrapped in layers of coarse, likely undyed wool. Tunics, hose, and cloaks formed the basic wardrobe, layered according to the severity of the cold. The scarcity of clothing meant garments were worn constantly and washed infrequently. This allowed dirt and grease to build up, unintentionally enhancing the fabric's wind and water resistance. offering a small degree of extra protection at the cost of hygiene. The human onion was often a rather grubby one. In conclusion, peasant clothing in winter was defined by the practical use of wool, the essential strategy of layering everything available, and the unavoidable accumulation of grime through constant wear and infrequent washing. This buildup, while unhygienic, inadvertently added a layer of improvised insulation and weatherproofing, supplementing the natural qualities of the wool. It stands as another example of how medieval peasants adapted, using the meager resources and even the dirt around them in their relentless, quiet battle for survival against the harsh realities of winter. As the last embers of the hearth fire are carefully banked beneath a mound of insulating ash, a deep quiet settles over the medieval peasant dwelling, broken only by the sighing of the wind outside or the occasional nocturnal stirrings of the natural world. The brief period of communal gathering around the fire's warmth gives way to the necessity of rest. But sleep, like every other aspect of peasant life in winter, was dictated by the harsh realities of survival, particularly the pervasive, inescapable cold. Tonight, let us explore the sleeping arrangements within these humble homes, focusing on the practice of communal sleeping, huddling together as a vital tactic against the winter night. Ease into comfort and let your mind drift to this scene of shared rest. We must first recall the fundamental layout of the typical peasant home. For the vast majority, it consisted of a single room. This one space served as kitchen, workshop, living area, and crucially as the sleeping quarters for the entire household. There were no separate bedrooms, no private chambers cordoned off for slumber. The concept of a dedicated room solely for sleeping was a luxury far beyond the reach or even the conception of the average medieval peasant family. Life unfolded from waking to sleeping within these four simple walls. The absence of dedicated bedrooms meant that sleep occurred wherever space could be found within this multifunctional room. Often a specific area might be informally designated for sleeping, perhaps the part of the floor furthest from the door to minimize drafts, or maybe slightly closer to the residual warmth radiating from the banked hearth. But it remained part of the common living space, not a separate sanctuary for rest. But the transition from waking activities to sleep involved merely shifting function within the same physical area. Sleeping surfaces were rudimentary, as we've touched upon before. Many peasants slept directly on the floor, perhaps atop the layer of straw or rushes that covered the cold earth. If slightly better off, they might possess a low wooden platform or frame, creating a shallow box filled with straw or bracken to form a communal paillasse. In either case, the sleeping surface was often shared, not individual. There were rarely enough beds or even designated floor spaces for each person to sleep in isolation. Resources like space were limited. This limitation of space and bedding naturally led to the practice of communal sleeping. The entire family unit, parents, children of various ages, perhaps elderly grandparents, and occasionally even unrelated servants or lodgers if the household included them, would sleep together in close proximity within the single room. Individual sleeping spaces were not the norm. Shared rest was the accepted reality, driven by the physical constraints of the dwelling and the scarcity of bedding materials like mattresses and blankets. However, the primary driver for this communal sleeping arrangement, especially during the harsh winter months, was the fundamental need for warmth. The peasant dwelling, as we've established, was drafty and poorly insulated. The banked hearth offered minimal residual heat overnight. In such an environment, a solitary sleeper would lose body heat rapidly to the cold air and the even colder floor. Staying warm enough to rest, let alone survive a frigid night, was a significant challenge that necessitated pooling resources, including body heat. Consider the simple physics involved. An individual body radiates heat outwards from its entire surface area. In a cold room, this heat dissipates quickly into the surrounding air and surfaces. By huddling together, multiple bodies reduce the amount of their surface area exposed directly to the cold. Surfaces pressed against another warm body lose heat far less rapidly than surfaces exposed to the cold air or the floor. Shared body heat becomes trapped within the cluster of sleepers, creating a microclimate significantly warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. This strategy has sometimes been informally described using analogies like the human lasagna or simply huddling like penguins. Imagine bodies arranged in close contact, perhaps side by side in rows or curled together. Each individual benefits from the warmth radiated by those next to them, while simultaneously contributing their own body heat to the collective pool. This mutual exchange drastically reduced the net loss of heat for everyone involved, making sleep possible in conditions that might otherwise be dangerously cold for individuals sleeping alone. The available bedding materials further encouraged this closeness. A family might possess only one or two coarse woolen blankets or perhaps some animal hides to serve as coverings. These limited resources would need to be shared amongst all the sleepers. Spreading a single blanket over multiple closely packed bodies was far more effective at trapping warmth than trying to allocate insufficient coverings to individuals sleeping separately. The scarcity of bedding itself mandated huddling together beneath the shared covering. The specific arrangement of bodies would likely have varied based on family size, available space, and tradition, but maximizing contact was key. People might lie tightly packed in rows, perhaps alternating direction to fit more closely. Spooning lying curled on one side with another person nestled closely behind would have been a common and efficient way to share warmth and fit into limited space. The goal was always to minimize exposure to the cold air and maximize body-to-body contact beneath the shared coverings. Children, being smaller and often losing heat more rapidly, were frequently placed in the most protected positions within the huddle. They might be sandwiched between their parents or older siblings, benefiting from the larger body's warmth on either side. This not only kept the children warmer but also offered them a sense of security in the dark, crowded room. Protecting the youngest members of the family from the cold was a primary concern, addressed directly by the communal sleeping arrangement. Similarly, elderly or infirm members of the household, who might feel the cold more acutely or have poorer circulation, would likely be given preferential placement within the shared sleeping space. Perhaps they slept closest to the banked hearths, faint residual warmth, or were positioned in the center of the huddle, shielded by the bodies of younger, healthier family members. The arrangement wasn't just about maximizing warmth generally, but also about distributing that warmth according to need, ensuring the most vulnerable were cared for. In some cases, particularly during the most severe cold snaps, the huddle might even extend beyond the human family members. To protect valuable livestock like a newborn calf, lamb, or perhaps chickens from freezing temperatures outside, peasants might bring them into the single-room dwelling overnight. These animals, while adding their own smells and potential for mess, also contributed their body heat to the interior space, further supplementing the warmth generated by the human occupants in the banked fire. It was another measure born of harsh necessity. An unavoidable consequence of this intense proximity was the complete lack of privacy. Imagine sharing not just a room, but often the same rudimentary bed or sleeping platform, with multiple other people, parents, children, siblings, perhaps grandparents. There was no personal space, no quiet retreat. Every cough, snore, rustle, or nighttime stirring was immediately apparent to everyone else. Bodily functions, smells, and sounds were shared experiences, stripped of any modern notion of individual privacy during rest. The sensory environment of this communal sleeping space would have been intense by modern standards. The air, already thick with residual wood smoke, would carry the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, perhaps damp wool or rushes, the earthy scent from the floor, and the potential addition of livestock odors. This would include breathing, snoring, coughing, the occasional cry of an infant, perhaps the rustling of straw bedding or the scratching of pests like mice or fleas attracted by the warmth and food scraps. Physical comfort was also minimal. The straw-filled palliasses or rush-covered floors were lumpy and hard. Drafts might still find their way across the floor, chilling exposed feet or faces. The rough wool blankets could be scratchy. Close proximity meant being jostled by restless sleepers. Pests like fleas or lice, common in the era, could make sleep itchy and unpleasant. Comfort was secondary. The primary goal was surviving the night's cold through shared warmth, however uncomfortable the conditions. It is vital to understand that this lack of privacy and physical comfort, which seems so challenging from our perspective, was the accepted norm for medieval peasants. The concept of individual bedrooms and personal space during sleep was largely alien to their experience. Communal sleeping was simply how life was lived. Discomforts were endured because the alternative, living alone and potentially freezing, was far worse. It was a shared condition of life, not seen as a particular hardship in itself relative to other daily struggles. This enforced closeness likely had social implications as well. Sharing such intimate space nightly could foster strong family bonds and a sense of interdependence. Children grew up with a constant physical connection to their parents and siblings. If non-family members shared the dwelling, communal sleeping could integrate them more fully into the household unit. It was a practice that reflected and reinforced the collective nature of peasant life, where the family operated as a single economic and social unit. However, this proximity also meant shared vulnerability. Illness could spread rapidly through a household sleeping in such close quarters. A cough carrying contagion would easily infect others nearby. Skin conditions or pests could pass quickly from person to person. And in the event of a house fire, a constant danger with open hearths and thatched roofs, the single room packed with sleeping bodies offered little chance for easy escape, potentially trapping the entire family. Imagine this scene at dawn, the first gray light filtering through tiny window openings or cracks in the wall. The collective stirring begins. Bodies slowly disentangle from the shared huddle. The air is cold, breath perhaps misting visibly. Stiffness from the hard sleeping surface, and the cramped positions needs working out. The transition from the relative warmth of the shared huddle back into the chill of the room marks the start of another day's labor, fueled by the preserved embers being coaxed back to life in the hearth. From a psychological perspective, communal sleeping likely offered a sense of security alongside the lack of privacy. Sleeping alone in the dark, cold hut might feel isolating and vulnerable. Being surrounded by the warm bodies of family offered reassurance against the dangers perceived to lurk in the night, whether real or imagined. It provided a tangible sense of belonging and mutual protection, even amidst the physical discomforts. There was safety in numbers, a warmth both physical and emotional. When we contrast this with modern Western sleeping arrangements, individual beds, private bedrooms, climate-controlled environments, the difference is stark. Our emphasis on privacy, personal space, and individual comfort during sleep is a relatively recent development, historically speaking, and largely a product of greater affluence and different housing structures. For the medieval peasants, such ideals were unattainable luxuries. Survival dictated a more communal and physically intimate approach to rest. Ultimately, the practice of communal sleeping, of huddling together for warmth, was driven by grim necessity. It was a direct response to the inadequacy of peasant housing and bedding against the winter cold. Comfort, privacy, and even hygiene were sacrificed in favor of the fundamental need to conserve body heat and survive the night. It was perhaps the most intimate and basic form of cooperation within the peasant family, a nightly reaffirmation of their interdependence in the face of a harsh environment. Let's visualize that huddle one more time. Feel the pressure of bodies close on either side, the shared weight of a rough blanket. Sense the faint warmth radiating from others, mingling with your own. Hear the soft sounds of breathing, perhaps a sigh or a rustle. The background murmur of a sleeping household packed together. Notice the lack of space to stretch, the acceptance of closeness as a shield against the greater discomfort of the biting cold that lies just beyond the shared blanket, just beyond the thin walls of the hut. This technique, this human huddle, was not a choice made for comfort or social preference. It was a non-negotiable tactic for survival. It demonstrates the lengths to which people had to go to simply endure the winter nights in poorly heated, poorly insulated dwellings. The warmth generated by the collective was a precious, self-produced resource, carefully conserved through proximity. It underlines the vulnerability of the individual and the strength found quite literally in sticking together against the cold. Children born into this reality would know no difference. Growing up intertwined with siblings and parents each night would shape their understanding of family, space, and the body. The boundaries we often take for granted would be blurred from infancy. This shared experience of nightly huddling lightly fostered a deep, instinctual understanding of mutual reliance, a physical embodiment of the family unit as the primary source of safety and warmth in a challenging world. Even the air breathed in that space was shared, recycled amongst the sleepers. While potentially facilitating the spread of airborne illnesses, it also meant the small volume of air within the hut was slightly warmed by collective respiration, fractionally reducing the chilling effect of inhaling truly frigid air. Every small factor, conscious or not, that conserved heat was part of this survival equation, played out nightly in the peasant home. The transition from the relative activity around the evening hearth to the tightly packed stillness of the communal sleeping arrangement marked a significant shift in the household's energy. Activity ceased, voices quieted, and the focus narrowed to the basic act of conserving warmth through the long, dark hours. It was a period of enforced inactivity and closeness, a time for the body to rest and recover as much as possible under challenging thermal conditions, preparing for the labor the next day would inevitably bring. Consider the trust involved. Sleeping in such close proximity required a fundamental trust amongst the household members. Individuals were vulnerable in sleep, and sharing that vulnerable state so intimately depended on implicit understandings of mutual respect and care, even within the rough confines of peasant life. While conflict surely existed, the nightly huddle necessitated a temporary suspension of disputes in favor of collective survival. The sheer duration of this practice is also worth contemplating. For centuries across vast regions of medieval Europe, this was the standard way for the majority of the population to pass the winter nights. It wasn't a temporary hardship or an unusual circumstance. It was the baseline reality for generations. This constant, intimate sharing of sleeping space shaped social norms and family dynamics in ways we can only partially reconstruct today. And so the peasant family slept, layered together like the onions they resembled in their daytime clothing, seeking warmth and security in mutual proximity. It was a strategy dictated by cold, by lack of space, by scarcity of resources. It lacked privacy, offered minimal comfort, and posed risks to health and safety. Yet, it was essential. The communal huddle stands as a powerful testament to the resilience and adaptability of medieval peasants, finding warmth not just from the hearth but from each other in their nightly battle against the winter cold. Let us delve deeper now into the intimate, often challenging reality of the medieval peasant home during the harshest spells of winter. We've explored the cold floors, the smoky hearth, the layered clothing, and the huddle of human bodies seeking warmth in shared sleep. But for some, particularly in colder regions or during exceptionally bitter weather, another source of warmth was brought directly into the living space, blurring the lines between human dwelling and animal shelter. Tonight we consider the practice of sharing the home with livestock, the animal roommates who provided vital heat at a considerable cost to comfort and hygiene. Breathe slowly, relax, and picture this crowded, pungent, yet warmer interior. The driving force behind this extraordinary measure was, once again, the desperate need for warmth. When the wind howled relentlessly and temperatures plummeted below freezing for extended periods, the meager heat from the banked hearth and human bodies alone might not suffice to prevent dangerous chilling within the poorly insulated hut. Animals, with their higher metabolisms and larger body masses, are essentially living furnaces. Bringing them indoors was a pragmatic, if unpleasant, way to significantly boost the ambient temperature of the shared living space. It was a strategy born of thermal desperation. The types of animals brought inside were typically the smaller, more valuable livestock. Full-grown cattle or oxen were generally too large for a small peasant hut and might have separate, though often adjoining, byres in more substantial longhouse structures. But younger calves, sheep, goats, perhaps a pig, and certainly poultry like chickens or geese were frequently brought into the main human living area during severe cold. These animals were manageable in size, represented significant economic value, and crucially, generated considerable body heat relative to their bulk. Indeed, protecting these animals was often a secondary, though important, motivation. Livestock represented a peasant family's wealth, their source of food, milk, wool, or traction power. Leaving vulnerable animals, especially young ones, outside in extreme cold, risked illness or death, a potentially ruinous loss. Bringing them indoors offered protection not only from the freezing temperatures but also from predators that might be emboldened by hunger during lean winter months. The warmth they provided to the humans was almost a byproduct of ensuring the animals' own survival, a mutual benefit in a harsh world. Even in peasant longhouses, which sometimes featured a distinct area or byre for animals separated from the human living space by a partition or passage, the proximity was still close. Heat would transfer through the partition, and smells and sounds would permeate the entire structure. In simpler single-room huts, however, the division was often non-existent. Animals might be tethered in a corner, perhaps penned loosely with simple hurdles, or sometimes allowed to find their own space amongst the human occupants and rudimentary furniture. The integration was direct. Consider the thermal contribution. A single sheep or goat can generate a surprising amount of body heat, comparable in output to a human. Several such animals, confined within a small, enclosed space, would noticeably raise the temperature. Their bodies radiated warmth constantly, warming the air, the floor, even the walls around them. While perhaps not making the hut warm by modern standards, the presence of livestock could lift the temperature by several crucial degrees, potentially making the difference between dangerous cold and mere discomfort for the human inhabitants. Imagine the spatial arrangement within the already cramped single room. The family huddles near the hearth or on their sleeping platform. In a designated corner, perhaps near the door or along one wall, stand a few sheep, tethered loosely, their woolly bodies pressed together. A goat might be tied to a roof support. Chickens might roost on a beam overhead or scratch amongst the rushes on the floor. Space was at an absolute premium, and the addition of animals made movement cautious and the environment significantly more crowded and chaotic. The most immediate and unavoidable consequence of sharing space with livestock was the smell. Animal manure has a pungent, pervasive odor, particularly in a confined, poorly ventilated space. Add to this the smell of damp wool or animal hides, the ammonia tang of urine soaking into the earth floor or straw bedding, and the general animal scent. The air within the hut would be thick with these smells, mingling unpleasantly with the lingering wood smoke, body odor, and dampness. It would have been an olfactory assault by modern standards. Then there were the sounds. Livestock are not silent roommates. Sheep bleat, goats utter their peculiar calls, pigs grunt and snuffle, chickens cluck and scratch. These noises would be a constant background accompaniment to human life within the hut, day and night. Sleep would be punctuated by the shuffling of hooves on the earth floor, The rattle of a tether, the sudden bleat of a lamb, or the crowing of a rooster long before dawn. The relative quiet we associate with nighttime rest would have been frequently interrupted. Beyond smell and sound, the physical presence of the animals impacted the space. Their bodies occupied valuable room. There was the constant risk of bumping into them in the dim light or even being accidentally trodden upon, particularly for small children. The texture of coarse wool, rough hides, or feathers became part of the domestic tactile environment. Animals might shift, lie down, stand up, their movements adding another layer of unpredictable activity within the confined space, demanding constant low-level awareness from the human occupants. Hygiene, already precarious, suffered immensely. Animals produce waste constantly. Manure and urine would be deposited directly onto the earth floor or into the floor coverings. While peasants would attempt to manage this, often by regularly laying down fresh layers of straw or rushes to absorb the waste, the floor inevitably became soiled and unsanitary. The sheer volume of waste produced by even a few animals in an enclosed space presented a continuous challenge to maintaining even a semblance of cleanliness. Managing this waste was an ongoing task. Accumulated manure might be periodically shoveled out and added to the household midden heap, eventually used as valuable fertilizer on the fields. Inside, however, the focus was often on covering rather than complete removal day to day. Thick layers of absorbent material like straw, bracken, or peat might build up, trapping the waste underneath, but also creating a damp, decomposing mat that harbored bacteria and contributed to the overall smell and unhygienic conditions. The presence of animals inevitably attracted more pests. Flies would be drawn to the manure and warmth, even in winter. Fleas, lice, and mites, specific to the animals, could easily transfer to the human occupants sleeping and living in such close proximity. The constant battle against biting insects and parasites, already a feature of medieval life, would be significantly intensified by sharing living quarters with livestock hosts. The itching and irritation would be relentless. Furthermore, this close cohabitation significantly increased the risk of zoonotic diseases, illnesses that can pass from animals to humans. Many diseases that afflicted medieval populations, including forms of influenza, poxviruses, salmonella, brucellosis, and parasitic infections like worms, could be carried by livestock and transmitted through contact with the animals themselves, their waste products, or the pests they attracted. Living alongside farm animals amplified the exposure to these pathogens, posing a constant, unseen threat to human health. The daily routine was shaped by the presence of animal roommates. If weather permitted, animals might be let outside for a period during the day to graze or relieve themselves, offering a brief respite for the human occupants. This required the effort of untethering, herding, and later bringing them back inside. Time would also be spent attempting to clean the animal area, laying fresh bedding, and ensuring the animals had water. Their needs added another layer of chores to the already laborious peasant day. Human sleep patterns were undoubtedly affected. Falling asleep and staying asleep amidst the constant symphony of animal sounds, the pervasive odors, and the occasional physical disturbance from a shifting sheep or goat would have been difficult. While people can adapt to background noise, the unpredictable nature of animal sounds and movements likely resulted in lighter, more easily disrupted sleep compared to a quiet environment. Rest, essential for enduring long days of physical labor, was compromised. Food safety was another concern. With animals living, eating, and excreting within the same single room where food was prepared, stored, and consumed, the risk of contamination was high. Manure, dust, bacteria carried on animal hides or feet, or attracted pests could easily find their way onto cooking surfaces, utensils, or stored food items, increasing the likelihood of foodborne illnesses. Maintaining food hygiene in such an environment required constant vigilance, likely often falling short. There was also the minor but persistent risk of accidental damage. A restless goat could knock over a pot, a clumsy calf might stumble into stored goods, chickens could peck at anything left accessible. While peasants had few valuable possessions, the potential for animals to disrupt the household order or damage essential items added another layer of low-level stress to the cohabitation arrangement. Everything had to be secured with the presence of unpredictable animals in mind. Despite these numerous and significant drawbacks, the smell, the noise, the filth, the pests, the disease risk, the compromised sleep, the practice of bringing animals indoors persisted in certain contexts because the benefits, primarily warmth and animal survival, were deemed essential for enduring the winter. It underscores the harshness of the conditions faced. Peasants were forced to tolerate deeply unpleasant living arrangements simply to make it through the coldest months. It was a calculated trade-off where survival trumped comfort. It's important to note that this practice wasn't universal across medieval Europe or throughout the entire period. Its prevalence depended heavily on the local climate severity, the type of dwelling common in the region, the specific economic situation of the peasant family, and cultural norms. In milder climates, or in regions where more substantial, partitioned housing was standard, sharing the immediate living space with livestock might have been less common or necessary. Or even. Archaeological evidence sometimes supports the picture of human-animal cohabitation. Excavations of medieval peasant dwellings occasionally reveal distinct soil layers, rich in phosphates and organic matter characteristic of animal manure, concentrated in specific areas of the floor plan. Sometimes faint traces of internal partitions or stake holes for tethering posts hint at how space might have been organized to accommodate both humans and animals within a single structure. Artistic depictions from the period rarely focus on the grimier aspects of peasant life, but occasional illustrations or manuscript illuminations might show animals near or within simple dwellings, hinting at this close relationship. Written accounts, though often focused on wealthier strata of society, sometimes allude to the close proximity between peasants and their livestock, acknowledging it as a feature of rural existence, particularly among the poor. The psychological impact of living in such constant, unavoidable intimacy with farm animals is hard to fully grasp from our modern perspective. It fundamentally blurred the conceptual line between the human domestic sphere and the agricultural world. Animals weren't just possessions kept elsewhere. They were immediate, tangible presences within the home, their bodily functions and needs interwoven with the humans' daily lives. This constant interaction must have shaped the peasants' relationship with and perception of their livestock. Comparing this to the strict separation typically maintained between human living spaces and farm animals in most modern developed societies highlights the vast gulf in living standards and expectations. Today, the idea of sharing a bedroom with a goat or chickens would be considered unacceptable, eccentric, or a sign of extreme poverty or crisis. For many medieval peasants in winter, however, it was a rational, if unpleasant, survival strategy employed when conditions demanded it. In conclusion, the practice of bringing livestock indoors during severe winter weather stands as a stark illustration of the extreme measures medieval peasants employed to survive. Driven primarily by the desperate need for supplementary warmth and the necessity of protecting valuable animals, this cohabitation filled the small dwelling with overwhelming smells, constant noise, and significant hygiene challenges. It was a clear sacrifice of comfort, cleanliness, and potentially health for the crucial benefits of added heat and acid protection, embodying the harsh trade-offs inherent in the medieval peasant's relentless struggle against the cold. We have journeyed through the tangible aspects of medieval peasant winter survival: the drafty homes, the smoky hearths, the layered clothing, the huddled sleeping arrangements, even the sharing of space with animals. Tonight, let us turn inwards to consider a more subtle, perhaps instinctual, adaptation. The very way a peasant might have controlled their breath in the face of biting, freezing air. While not a documented tactic in the way we might think of one today, modifying breathing could have been a deeply ingrained response to the harsh realities of inhaling winter's chill. Settle into stillness, breathe gently yourself, and ponder the simple act of respiration in a profoundly cold world. Imagine stepping out of the relative smoky warmth of the hut into the pre-dawn darkness of a deep winter morning. The air hits you not just as cold, but as a physical shock. It bites at exposed skin, and when drawn into the body, it can feel like inhaling ice. This extreme cold posed a direct challenge not just to overall body temperature, but specifically to the delicate tissues of the respiratory system. Protecting the lungs from this thermal assault may have prompted unconscious or perhaps even conscious adjustments in breathing. Deeply inhaling very cold, dry air can be intensely uncomfortable, even painful. It can trigger coughing spasms as the airways constrict in response to the cold shock. It can feel like it burns the back of the throat and chills the chest from within. Beyond immediate discomfort, there was likely a perception, rooted perhaps in experience, that constantly breathing freezing air deep into the lungs could make one more susceptible to the coughs, fevers, and lung ailments that were a constant threat during winter. What might have been broadly termed catching a chill or inflammation of the lungs. Fortunately, the human body possesses a natural, elegant system for conditioning the air we breathe, the nasal passages. As air travels through the nose, it passes over a large surface area lined with moist mucous membranes and rich networks of blood vessels. This intricate structure acts as a heat exchanger and humidifier. The air is warmed by the blood flow close to the surface and picks up moisture from the mucous membranes before it reaches the sensitive lung. Breathing through the nose is the body's first line of defense against cold, dry air. Contrast this with breathing through the mouth. Mouth breathing largely bypasses the sophisticated warming and humidifying apparatus of the nasal passages. Cold, dry air is drawn more directly down the trachea and into the lungs, retaining much of its original chilling and drying character. While necessary during heavy exertion when large volumes of air are needed quickly, habitual mouth breathing in very cold conditions delivers a much harsher impact directly to the lower airways, potentially causing greater irritation and discomfort. Given this physiological reality, it is reasonable to speculate, and we must stress this is speculation based on physiology, not direct historical record, that medieval peasants instinctively or consciously prioritized nose breathing when exposed to extreme cold. They would have felt the immediate difference in comfort between a gasp of icy air through the mouth versus a slower draw through the nose. This simple act of keeping the mouth closed and breathing nasally whenever possible could have been a fundamental, low-level adaptation to the winter environment. Beyond simply using the nose, another potential adjustment involves the depth of breathing. Taking deep, full breaths draws a larger volume of cold air into the lungs with each cycle. Shallower breaths, while potentially less efficient for oxygen uptake, bring in a smaller quantity of cold air at a time. It's plausible that in situations of extreme cold, particularly when at rest or performing light tasks, peasants might have unconsciously adopted a pattern of slightly shallower breathing to minimize the chilling effect within their airways, conserving precious body heat and moisture. The rationale for such adjustments, prioritizing nose breathing and perhaps taking shallower breaths, would be multifold. Firstly, minimizing the physical discomfort and irritation caused by inhaling raw, freezing air. Secondly, reducing the body's heat loss as warming inhaled air consumes energy. Thirdly, conserving moisture, as cold winter air is often very dry, and exhaling warm, moist air represents a water loss. Finally, potentially reducing the perceived risk of respiratory ailments associated with prolonged exposure to severe cold air deep in the lungs. This type of breathing adjustment would be most relevant during exposure to the harshest conditions, certainly when outdoors performing tasks like gathering wood, tending livestock, or traveling in freezing weather, but perhaps also indoors within the cold, drafty hut, especially upon waking in the morning before the fire was fully reestablished, when the ambient air temperature inside might not be significantly higher than outside. Those first breaths of the day could be particularly chilling. Was this a conscious, deliberately practiced survival breathing technique? Probably not in the modern sense. It's more likely to have been an instinctual response, learned through experience and perhaps passed on implicitly. Just as one learns to squint against bright sun or huddle against wind, peasants likely learned through lived experience that breathing certain ways felt better or seemed less likely to lead to coughing fits or lingering chest discomfort in extreme cold. It became an ingrained habit born from environmental pressure. This potential modification of breathing aligns closely with the very practical act of covering the face in cold weather. Pulling a woolen cloak, scarf, or even just a hand over the nose and mouth creates a small pocket of trapped air. This air is warmed and humidified by exhaled breath, meaning the subsequent inhalation draws in air that is already partially conditioned before it even enters the nasal passages. This physical barrier works in concert with nasal breathing to further temper the inhaled air's harshness, a tactic surely employed instinctively. However, deliberately altering one's breathing pattern, particularly towards shallower breaths, is not without its own discomforts and limitations. Breathing primarily through the nose can feel restrictive, especially if the nasal passages are partially congested due to a cold or the smoky indoor air. Consciously taking shallow breaths can lead to a feeling of air hunger, a slight dizziness, or even anxiety if the body feels it isn't getting enough oxygen. It requires a degree of mental effort to override the body's natural drive to breathe deeply when needed. Furthermore, there are clear physiological limits. The human body requires a certain amount of oxygen to function, especially during physical labor. Peasants engaged in demanding tasks like chopping wood or walking through deep snow simply could not afford to breathe shallowly for extended periods. They would be forced to breathe more deeply, often through the mouth, to meet their body's metabolic demands, accepting the respiratory discomfort as a necessary price for performing the work essential for survival. Therefore, any survival breathing strategy would have involved a constant, perhaps unconscious balancing act. It was likely a dynamic process adjusting based on the ambient temperature, the level of physical exertion, and individual factors like nasal congestion. At rest in the cold, nose breathing and shallower breaths might prevail. During hard work, deeper, likely mouth breathing became unavoidable, perhaps interspersed with periods of recovery using more controlled nasal breathing. It is crucial to reiterate the speculative nature of this discussion. We lack specific historical texts or widespread archaeological evidence detailing medieval peasant breathing techniques. Unlike fire banking or clothing layers, breathing patterns leave few direct traces. Our understanding is based on applying known physiological principles to the well-documented harsh environmental conditions faced by medieval peasants. It's a plausible inference about bodily adaptation, not a documented historical fact. Yet the widespread belief, prevalent even today in many cultures, that breathing cold air can directly cause illness, catching a chill, might have strongly encouraged behaviors aimed at avoiding it. If peasants believed that inhaling icy air was a direct pathway to sickness, they would have been highly motivated to minimize it through whatever means felt effective, including modifying their breathing pattern and covering their faces, regardless of whether the underlying belief was medically accurate by modern standards. Try to imagine the sensory experience. Feel the sharp, painful sting as truly frigid air hits the back of your throat when you gasp through your mouth. Contrast that with the slower, less aggressive sensation of cold entering through the nose, feeling it gradually warm as it travels inwards. Now imagine the conscious effort of keeping your breaths shallow, the slight, persistent feeling of needing more air, the deliberate focus required to maintain that pattern against your body's deeper instincts, all while enduring the external cold. This internal focus, this minute management of the simple act of breathing, highlights the intimate and often adversarial relationship between the medieval peasant and their environment. Survival wasn't just about external shields like walls and clothes. It potentially involved regulating the very way the body interacted with the elements at the most fundamental level, the exchange of air. It suggests a deep, embodied awareness of the environment's impact, extending even to the air inhaled. We see echoes of this today. Watch people outdoors on a truly freezing day. Many will instinctively breathe through their nose more, pull scarves or collars higher over their mouths, or turn their faces away from the wind when inhaling. While we have far superior clothing and heated shelters, the basic physiological response to inhaling painfully cold air remains. We still instinctively seek to temper the air before it reaches our lungs, suggesting the plausibility of similar, perhaps more pronounced adaptations in the past. This hypothetical survival breathing might also connect to the smoky interiors we discussed earlier. Chronic exposure to wood smoke could irritate nasal passages and lungs, perhaps making them even more sensitive to the additional insult of cold air. Furthermore, irritated or congested nasal passages might force more mouth breathing, ironically increasing exposure to the very cold, dry air that could exacerbate respiratory problems. It highlights the compounding environmental stresses peasants faced. Could this careful breathing have had a meditative quality? Perhaps. In the quiet cold, focusing on the breath, regulating its flow, minimizing the intake of the harsh outer world, it might have inadvertently become a form of mindful practice, a way of maintaining internal composure amidst external adversity. This is purely conjecture, of course, but it hints at the potential psychological dimensions of such subtle bodily adaptations required for enduring hardship. The effort involved should not be underestimated. Maintaining a pattern of shallow nasal breathing, especially when the body craves more air or the nose feels blocked, requires conscious effort and can be tiring in itself. It's another small energy expenditure, another layer of management added to the already demanding task of simply existing through a medieval winter. It wouldn't have been easy or always comfortable, undertaken only because the perceived alternative, gulping icy air, felt worse or more dangerous. Consider also the variation among individuals. Some people naturally tolerate cold air better than others. Some might have had chronic respiratory issues making them more sensitive. Others might have been mouth breathers by habit. The extent to which any individual peasant consciously or unconsciously modified their breathing would likely vary greatly. We are discussing a potential tendency, a plausible adaptation, not a universal, uniform practice. The very dryness of winter air was also a factor. Cold air holds very little moisture. Inhaling this dry air and exhaling warm, moisture-laden breath represents a significant loss of body water over time. Breathing through the nose helps reclaim some of this moisture during exhalation, and potentially taking shallower breaths might marginally reduce the total volume of water lost through respiration. Conserving hydration was another aspect of surviving challenging conditions. Let's revisit the idea of instinct versus conscious technique. It seems most probable that prioritizing nose breathing in the cold is largely instinctual. Driven by immediate sensory feedback, it simply feels less harsh. The shallow breathing aspect is perhaps more ambiguous. It might arise naturally when trying to breathe gently through the nose, or it could be a more conscious effort to minimize the intake volume. The line between instinct, learned behavior, and conscious tactic can be blurry in such fundamental bodily processes. Imagine the cumulative effect over a long winter, day after day, week after week, of breathing either smoky indoor air or frigid outdoor air. The constant low-level stress on the respiratory system must have taken a toll. Any strategy, even a subtle and perhaps imperfect one like modifying breathing patterns that offered even marginal relief or protection, would likely have been adopted, refined through trial and error, and integrated into the repertoire of winter survival skills. This focus on breath also connects to the concept of vital energy or life force, common in many pre-modern belief systems. Air and breath were often seen as fundamental carriers of life. Protecting the breath, ensuring the air taken in was not harmful, might have held a significance beyond mere physical comfort, potentially tying into broader beliefs about maintaining health and vitality in a challenging world. So while we lack explicit medieval peasant manuals on winter breathing techniques, the physiological principles are clear. Breathing cold, dry air is harsh on the respiratory system. The nose provides natural conditioning. Modifying breathing to prioritize nasal intake and perhaps reduce volume per breath offers plausible benefits in terms of comfort, heat/moisture conservation, and potentially reducing respiratory irritation. It represents a fascinating, speculative dimension of the human body's capacity to adapt to extreme environments. In conclusion, the concept of survival breathing, prioritizing nasal and perhaps shallower breaths, offers a glimpse into the potential for subtle, internal bodily adjustments as part of the medieval peasant's winter toolkit. Driven by the immediate discomfort and potential health risks of inhaling freezing air, this largely instinctual adaptation worked alongside external measures like clothing and shelter. It underscores the intimate, constant negotiation between the peasant body and its harsh environment, where even the simple act of drawing breath became part of the strategy for enduring the relentless cold. Having explored the external defenses and bodily adjustments employed by medieval peasants against the winter's onslaught, let us now turn our focus inward to the very fuel that powered their bodies and provided an essential source of internal heat: their food. In the depths of winter, eating wasn't just about satisfying hunger or providing energy for labor. It was a crucial survival tactic, particularly the evening meal, designed to stoke the body's internal furnace against the long, cold night. Relax your body, quiet your mind, and consider how the simple act of digestion became a source of vital warmth. The fundamental challenge during a cold winter night was maintaining core body temperature. As the peasant family huddled together in their drafty hut, the external environment constantly worked to leach away precious warmth. The banked hearth provided only minimal heat, and body heat alone, even when shared, might struggle against truly frigid conditions. Therefore, generating heat from within the body became critically important, supplementing the warmth preserved by clothing and communal sleeping. Food was the key to this internal heat production. Our bodies are constantly engaged in metabolism, the chemical processes that sustain life. These processes inherently generate heat. Think of the body as an engine. Burning fuel releases energy, and a significant portion of that energy is released as heat. The fuel for the human body comes from the calories consumed in food. Therefore, consuming adequate calories was essential not just for movement and basic function, but directly for thermoregulation, maintaining a stable internal temperature against external cold. There's a specific phenomenon known as the thermic effect of food, or TEF, sometimes called diet-induced thermogenesis. This refers to the energy expenditure and subsequent heat generation that occurs specifically during the digestion, absorption, and processing of nutrients after a meal. Essentially, the body has to work to break down food, and this work generates heat. Eating literally warms you up from the inside. Beyond the immediate caloric energy the food provides, this effect was likely an important, if perhaps unconsciously understood, factor in peasant winter diets. Different types of food have slightly different thermic effects. Protein generally requires the most energy to process, thus generating the most heat relative to its calories. Carbohydrates also have a significant thermic effect. Fats, while the most calorie-dense fuel source, providing sustained energy, generally have a lower immediate thermic effect compared to protein and carbs. Peasant diets were often heavy in complex carbohydrates from grains and legumes, supplemented with proteins and fats when available, providing both immediate thermic boosts and sustained fuel. The timing and composition of the evening meal were likely crucial for leveraging this internal heat generation overnight. A substantial calorie-dense meal consumed in the hours before sleep would ensure that the process of digestion, with its associated heat release, continued throughout the coldest part of the night. This slow, steady release of internal warmth could make a significant difference in enduring the chill while sleeping on a cold floor in a drafty hut, helping to prevent a dangerous drop in core body temperature during the long hours of inactivity. What constituted a typical peasant evening meal in winter? It was often centered around a hearty pottage or stew, This was a one-pot dish, simmered for hours over the hearth, making efficient use of fuel. The base was usually water or thin broth thickened with grains like oats, barley, or rye, and bulked out with whatever vegetables were available, typically stored root vegetables like turnips, carrots, though not the bright orange varieties we know today, parsnips, and onions, along with dried legumes such as peas or beans soaked and cooked until soft. This ubiquitous pottage was the backbone of the peasant diet. It was filling, relatively easy to digest after long cooking, and importantly served hot, providing immediate warmth upon consumption. The combination of complex carbohydrates from grains and vegetables provided slow relimo energy and contributed significantly to the thermic effect. It was a simple, adaptable meal varying based on seasonal availability and household resources, but always aimed at providing substantial, warming sustenance. Grains were fundamental. Besides thickening pottages, they were consumed as coarse breads, typically made from rye or barley, often mixed with bean or pea flour. These dark, heavy loaves were dense and filling, eaten alongside the pottage, or perhaps dipped into it. Bread added significantly to the meal's carbohydrate load and caloric density. It provided bulk and energy, essential for feeling full and fueling the body's internal furnace through the night. Fats, though often scarcer in peasant diets compared to carbohydrates, were highly prized, especially in winter. Animal fats like lard from pigs, tallow or suet from cattle or sheep, butter or cheese when available were crucial for increasing the calorie density of meals. A dollop of lard stirred into the pottage, suet rendered down, or a piece of hard cheese eaten with bread could significantly boost the energy content, providing a longer-letting fuel source for overnight heat generation. Fat represented concentrated energy, vital for cold endurance. Protein sources were varied but often limited. Dried peas and beans cooked into the pottage were a primary source. Eggs from backyard chickens, milk or cheese from a family cow or goat, if owned, or occasional scraps of meat or offal, perhaps from a pig slaughtered in autumn or from trapping small game, all contributed valuable protein. While perhaps not the bulk of the meal, the protein content would have enhanced the thermic effect of food, adding to the post-meal heat generation critical for staying warm. The emphasis was consistently on calorie density and volume. A light meal would simply not suffice. To generate significant internal heat throughout a long, cold night, the body needed a substantial amount of fuel to process. The evening meal needed to be heavy, filling, and rich in energy. Peasants likely aimed to go to bed with a full stomach, understanding intuitively, if not scientifically, that this state was associated with greater warmth and resilience against the nightly chill. There's a distinct physical sensation associated with a full stomach after a hot, heavy meal, a feeling of internal warmth spreading outwards. This wasn't just psychological, it was the tangible effect of increased blood flow to the digestive system and the heat generated by the initial stages of metabolism. For the medieval peasant settling down to sleep in a cold hut, this feeling of internal warmth radiating from a belly full of pottage and bread would have been deeply comforting and reassuring. Think of the digestive system working through the night as a slow-burning internal furnace. The complex carbohydrates, proteins, and fats consumed in the evening meal were being gradually broken down, absorbed, and metabolized. Each step in this intricate process released small amounts of heat, contributing to the maintenance of core body temperature. A substantial meal ensured this internal furnace remained stoked for many hours, providing a continuous low level of heat generation throughout the period of sleep and inactivity. This internal heat generation might have directly impacted sleep quality, albeit in ways different from modern ideals of comfort. While sleeping on a very full stomach can feel uncomfortable to us, the gentle internal warmth produced by digestion might have actually promoted sleep in extremely cold conditions by preventing the deep chill that could otherwise make rest impossible. It might have allowed for longer periods of uninterrupted sleep by counteracting the constant drain of body heat to the cold environment. The timing of this crucial meal likely occurred relatively close to bedtime. Eating the main heavy meal later in the evening, perhaps after the day's outdoor labor was finished and just before the fire was banked, would maximize the duration of the thermic effect overlapping with the coldest hours of the night. This scheduling ensured the peak of digestive heat generation occurred when it was most needed, during the long and active period of sleep when external heat sources were minimal. However, we must temper this picture of ideal caloric loading with the harsh reality of medieval peasant life, food scarcity. While a heavy evening meal was the goal, it wasn't always achievable. Food supplies dwindled over the winter months. The period late winter and early spring before the first new crops could be harvested was often known as the hungry gap. During these times, meals might become thinner, less frequent, relying more heavily on stored grains and less on fats or proteins. The ability to eat for warmth was constrained by availability. Winter diets relied heavily on preserved foods, grains stored in sacks or bins, legumes dried in the autumn, root vegetables kept in clamps or cellars, perhaps salted or smoked meats or fish from the autumn slaughter or catch, though meat was often a luxury. These stored foods formed the basis of winter meals, requiring long cooking times to become palatable and digestible, perfectly suited for the slow simmer pottage that dominated the evening menu. Foraging and hunting offered limited possibilities in deep winter, but any success could provide vital supplements. Gathering firewood might also involve finding edible roots or nuts missed in autumn. Trapping small animals like rabbits or birds could yield precious meat, adding much-needed protein and fat to the pot. These additions, while perhaps infrequent, would have been highly valued contributions to the winter diet and the body's ability to generate heat. Warm liquids consumed with the evening meal also played a role. The hot pottage itself provided immediate warmth. Drinking warm broth, weak ale, often safer than water and providing some calories, or perhaps herbal infusions could further boost the feeling of internal heat and aid hydration. The simple act of consuming something warm had both a physical and psychological comforting effect against the enveloping cold. Beyond the purely physiological effects, a hot, filling evening meal offered significant psychological comfort. In the face of a cold, dark, and often uncertain night, the ritual of gathering to eat a substantial meal provided a sense of security, normalcy, and reassurance. It reinforced the family unit and offered a tangible defense against the harshness of the environment. The feeling of satiation was likely strongly associated with safety and well-being during winter. This emphasis on heavy, warming foods likely contrasted with diets in warmer months. In summer, when the body wasn't constantly fighting external cold, meals might be lighter, featuring more fresh greens and fruits when available, and the need for intense internal heat generation overnight would be much lower. The winter diet was specifically adapted, through necessity, to maximize caloric intake and thermogenesis for survival. Direct historical evidence, explicitly stating peasants ate heavy meals specifically to generate overnight heat, is scarce. Peasants rarely recorded their dietary strategies. However, analysis of skeletal remains, archaeological findings related to food processing and storage, and surviving descriptions of medieval diets strongly indicate a reliance on calorie-dense, carbohydrate-heavy foods, especially in winter. Combining this with our understanding of human physiology and the thermic effect of food makes this strategy highly plausible and logical. It's also important to acknowledge the limitations. While calorie-dense, the overall quality of the peasant diet was often poor by modern standards. Lacking in certain vitamins and micronutrients, chronic malnutrition or undernutrition could limit the body's ability to efficiently metabolize food and generate heat, even if the type of food consumed was geared towards warmth. The effectiveness of eating for warmth depended on having enough food of sufficient quality in the first place. Consider again the pottage simmering over the fire, the thick blend of grains, vegetables, perhaps some dried beans, maybe a scrap of fatty bacon or a knob of butter stirred in. It represented energy, warmth, survival. Each spoonful was fuel, not just for the next day's work, but for the immediate battle against the night's cold. The slow digestion of this heavy mixture was an unseen internal process, yet vital as the layers of wool or the huddle of bodies. The entire cycle of food production, preservation, and preparation was oriented towards ensuring this supply of internal fuel through the winter. Autumn harvests were carefully stored, animals were husbanded, fuel for cooking was gathered, all culminating in the daily ritual of preparing and consuming meals, designed, consciously or unconsciously, to provide the thermal energy needed to endure until spring. Food was metabolic firewood. Imagine the difference between facing a freezing night on an empty stomach versus a full one. The gnawing emptiness combined with the penetrating cold would feel significantly worse, more dangerous. The feeling of fullness, even if bordering on discomfort from sheer volume, provided a buffer, a reserve of internal energy being steadily converted into warmth, making the cold slightly more bearable, sleep slightly more attainable. The process wasn't instantaneous. The thermic effect peaks sometime after eating and can continue for several hours. This slow, prolonged release of heat was perfectly suited to the long duration of a winter night. It wasn't about a quick burst of warmth, but a steady, low-level internal smoldering that helped keep the core temperature stable during the extended period of rest and exposure to cold. So, while peasants layered themselves in wool and huddled together against the external chill, they also employed an internal strategy, fueling their bodies with substantial calorie-dense evening meals. The grains, legumes, fats, and proteins consumed were broken down through the night, releasing vital heat through the thermic effect of food. This eating for warmth was a fundamental, physiologically sound tactic, turning the very act of digestion into a source of survival against the unforgiving cold of the medieval winter night. Beyond the fundamental strategies of shelter, clothing, communal warmth, and fueling the body's internal furnace with food, the medieval peasant often employed further ingenuity to combat the winter's chill. Faced with limited resources, they developed simple, low-tech methods to create pockets of warmth or preserve precious heat using the materials readily available around them. Tonight, let us explore two such examples of improvised warmth: the use of heated stones as rudimentary bed warmers, and the clever application of insulation in hay boxes to keep food hot for extended periods. Let your mind drift and settle on these small but significant acts of practical resourcefulness. We begin with the humble heated stone. Imagine settling into the cold, damp bedding on the floor of the peasant hut. Even with shared body heat, the initial shock of the cold sleeping surface could be intense, chilling one to the bone and making sleep difficult to find. The banked hearth offered little radiating warmth across the room. There was a clear need for a source of localized, sustained heat directly within the sleeping area, something to ease that initial transition into the cold bedding. Nature provided a simple solution: stones. Stones possess good thermal mass, meaning they can absorb a significant amount of heat and then release it slowly over time. They were abundant, readily available around fields, riverbeds, or quarries. Certain types of dense, non-porous stones were ideal for this purpose. Selecting the right stone was likely part of the acquired knowledge. Avoiding stones, particularly some river stones that might crack or even explode dangerously when heated due to trapped moisture turning to steam. The method was straightforward. Suitable stones would be placed in or very near the embers of the hearth fire during the evening as the fire was burning. They needed time to absorb the heat deep into their core. Care would be taken not to overheat them to the point of being red hot, which would pose too great a risk, but to get them substantially hot, too hot to touch directly, capable of radiating warmth for a considerable period. This required judgment based on experience. Once sufficiently heated, the stone had to be carefully retrieved from the hearth. This might be done using makeshift tongs fashioned from green wood, sturdy sticks, or perhaps thick pieces of cloth or leather if available, to avoid direct contact and severe burns. Handling a heavy, intensely hot stone required caution and steady hands. Dropping it could scatter embers or cause injury. It was a task demanding respect for the stored heat within the stone. The most crucial step, essential for both safety and effectiveness, was wrapping the hot stone. A naked hot stone placed in bedding would instantly scorch or ignite the straw, rushes, or woolen blankets, and would cause severe burns if it came into contact with skin. Therefore, the heated stone was carefully wrapped in multiple layers of thick, coarse cloth, perhaps old rags, scraps of worn-out woolen garments, or pieces of sacking. This wrapping served multiple purposes. Firstly, the layers of cloth acted as insulation, slowing down the rate at which the stone released its heat. This meant the warmth would last longer through the night, providing a more sustained effect rather than a brief, intense burst. Secondly, the wrapping moderated the surface temperature, making it safe to place near the body or within the bedding without causing immediate burns. Thirdly, it contained the stone itself, preventing direct contact with flammable materials. The thickness and number of layers determined how quickly the heat radiated. Once safely wrapped, the heated stone parcel could be placed strategically within the sleeping area. It might be positioned at the foot of the communal sleeping space to warm cold feet, or perhaps placed near the center to radiate warmth towards the bodies huddled nearby. Tucked under the blankets or hides, the wrapped stone acted like a primitive hot water bottle, slowly releasing its stored thermal energy into the immediate vicinity, easing the chill of the bedding and providing a comforting pool of warmth. The benefit of this simple technology was tangible warmth, where it was most needed, directly in the sleeping area for potentially several hours into the night. It could make the difference between shivering uncontrollably and being able to relax enough to fall asleep. It eased the misery of climbing into cold, damp bedding and provided a focal point of comfort in the otherwise chilly darkness. For children or the elderly, this localized warmth could be particularly beneficial. However, this practice was not without significant risks, demanding constant vigilance. The most obvious danger was burns. If the stone was too hot or the wrapping insufficient or displaced during the night, direct contact with skin could cause serious injury. Sleeping people might shift unknowingly against the hot bundle. Children, especially, might be vulnerable. Careful wrapping and placement were paramount to avoid harm from the very object meant to provide comfort. Another major risk was the fire. If the wrapping material was too thin, worn, or became dislodged, the hot stone could come into direct contact with the highly flammable bedding materials, the straw or rushes of the floor covering or mattress filling or the woolen blankets. Even a tightly wrapped stone, if excessively hot, could potentially smolder or ignite surrounding materials in the confined space. Spearheading using heated stones required a constant awareness of fire safety in an already hazardous environment. Therefore, successfully and safely using heated stones relied on accumulated knowledge and careful judgment. Knowing which stones to use, how hot to heat them without making them dangerous, how thickly to wrap them, and where to place them safely were skills likely passed down through generations. It was a simple technique, but one requiring experience and a healthy respect for the power of concentrated heat and the flammability of the peasant home's contents. Imagine the sensory experience, the faint earthy smell of the heated stone itself, mingled with the scent of the warm, perhaps slightly scorched woolen rags used for wrapping, the feeling of localized, penetrating warmth slowly spreading through the bedding, easing the ache of cold bones. The weight of the stone under the covers. It was a small, tangible comfort, a piece of the day's fire carried into the night's cold, procured through simple effort and careful handling. Now let us turn to another ingenious use of simple materials for managing heat, this time focused on food. The hay box cooker, or fireless cooker. While the hearth was the center of cooking, fuel was precious, and keeping food warm for extended periods, especially after the main fire was banked, presented a challenge. The hay box offered a clever solution based on the principle of insulation. It allowed food to continue cooking slowly, or stay hot for hours using its own trapped heat. The principle is simple: minimize heat loss. Just as layers of clothing trap body heat, layers of insulating material can trap the heat within a pot of hot food. A hay box was essentially a container packed with highly effective insulating material, usually dried hay or straw, which has excellent thermal resistance due to the trapped air within its structure. Other materials like feathers, wool scraps, or even tightly packed rags could also serve as insulation if hay was scarce. The construction was rudimentary. It might be a simple wooden box, perhaps crudely nailed together, or it could be a sturdy woven basket. In some cases, peasants might even dig a pit in the earth floor of the hut, lining it thickly with hay or straw. The key requirements were a container large enough to hold a cooking pot and a substantial amount of surrounding insulation, plus a way to cover it tightly to prevent heat escaping from the top. The method of use was equally straightforward. A meal, typically the standard pottage or stew, would be brought to a rolling boil on the hearth fire. Cooking it thoroughly on the fire initially was important. Once the food was piping hot, the lidded pot was carefully lifted from the fire. A deep nest would be made in the tightly packed hay or straw within the hay box. The hot pot, with its lid securely in place, was settled firmly into this nest. Now immediately more hay or straw was packed snugly all around the sides of the pot, filling any gaps, and then piled thickly over the top of the lid. The lid of the outer box, if it had one, was then closed tightly. The pot of hot food was now completely surrounded by a thick layer of insulation, drastically reducing the rate at which heat could escape. The food, using its own thermal energy, would continue to cook gently or remain hot for many hours. This simple device offered several significant benefits, particularly valuable in winter. Firstly, it was a remarkable fuel saver. Once the food reached boiling point on the hearth, it could be transferred to the hay box, freeing up the fire for other uses, or allowing it to be banked earlier, conserving precious firewood or peat. The food continued its cooking process using only the heat it already contained, trapped by the insulation. This was crucial when fuel was scarce or labor was needed elsewhere. Secondly, and perhaps most relevant to our theme of winter warmth, the hay box provided access to hot food long after the main fire had died down or been banked for the night. A peasant waking cold in the middle of the night or early in the morning could potentially retrieve the pot from the hay box and find still hot, or at least very warm, pottage. Consuming this warm food provided immediate comfort and, crucially, calories to help regenerate body heat when it was most needed. This access to warm sustenance outside of main meal times could be a significant aid to survival. Instead of facing the chill with an empty stomach until the morning fire was fully going, a peasant could consume warm, energy-rich food preserved by the hay box. This helped maintain core temperature, provided fuel for the body's internal furnace, and offered psychological comfort during the coldest, darkest hours. It was like having a thermos flask for stew, centuries before thermos flasks were invented. Thirdly, the hay box offered convenience. Food could be prepared earlier in the day when the fire was active and then kept hot until the evening meal, or even overnight. This flexibility could be valuable when agricultural tasks or other demands occupied daylight hours. It also freed up space on the potentially crowded hearth. The hay box acted as a slow cooker and a food warmer, all in one simple, fuel-free device after the initial heating. The connection to winter survival is clear. By conserving fuel, extending the availability of hot food, and providing warm calories during the coldest parts of the night or early morning, The haybox directly contributed to the peasants' ability to endure harsh conditions. It represented an efficient management of heat energy, capturing the intense heat generated by burning precious fuel and preserving it for later use through the simple but effective power of insulation. Complete success. The beauty of the haybox lay in its simplicity and accessibility. It required no special technology, only readily available materials, a container and dried plant matter. Wood for a box, reeds or willow for a basket, or simply a hole in the ground provided the structure. Hay or straw from the fields or animal bedding provided the insulation. Any peasant family could construct and utilize this device with minimal effort or expense. While direct archaeological evidence for hayboxes can be subtle, perhaps a distinctively lined pit near a hearth or remnants of a wooden box with organic residue, the principle of fireless cooking using insulation is well documented across various cultures and historical periods. It represents a logical and effective application of basic thermal principles, entirely plausible within the technological and material context of medieval peasant life. Consider the ingenuity, using the waste product of grain harvesting, straw or dried grass from the meadow, hay, to create a device that saves fuel and preserves warmth. It reflects a deep understanding of natural materials and their properties, born from necessity and close observation. Heated stones and hay-filled boxes represent small but clever victories in the ongoing battle against heat loss and scarcity. In conclusion, the use of heated stones and haybox cookers exemplifies the resourcefulness of medieval peasants in their struggle against winter. These were not grand technologies but simple, improvised solutions, using everyday materials to address specific needs, localized warmth in cold beds, and the preservation of precious heat and calories in cooked food. They represent a practical wisdom, an ability to harness basic physical principles like heat retention and insulation, adding crucial tools to their repertoire for surviving the challenges of the cold season. As the medieval peasant household settles into the deep quiet of a winter night, huddled together for warmth, the banked fire glows faintly beneath its blanket of ash. Sleep offers respite from the day's toil, but the night holds its own challenges. The cold is relentless, the darkness profound, and the carefully preserved fire, though dormant, requires trust. Tonight, let us consider a potential, perhaps less common strategy employed during the most severe conditions. The possibility of a night watch, where family members might take turns staying partially awake to guard the precious embers and fend off the worst of the infiltrating chill. Relax your body, let your thoughts drift, and imagine the quiet vigilance within the sleeping hut. The hearth fire was the absolute heart of the peasant home in winter, the primary source of warmth, the only reliable light, the means to cook, and a vital psychological comfort against the bleakness outside. Its continuous presence was paramount. Allowing the fire to completely die out overnight courted disaster, necessitating the laborious, uncertain process of restarting it from scratch in the frigid morning air. Therefore, preserving the fire through the night was a non-negotiable aspect of survival. The standard, widespread technique for this was banking the fire, as we've discussed previously. Carefully covering the best embers with a thick layer of insulating ash dramatically slowed their combustion, allowing them to smolder gently for many hours, ready to be revived at dawn. This ingenious method was usually effective, conserving fuel while keeping the potential for fire alive. For most nights, banking the fire likely sufficed, allowing the entire household to seek rest, however communal and uncomfortable. However, banking was not foolproof, and anxieties might linger, especially during periods of extreme cold, violent winds, or when using damp or poor-quality fuel. What if the embers were too weak, or the ash covering too thick, causing the fire to extinguish completely before morning? The prospect of waking to a dead hearth and facing the full force of the cold without immediate warmth was a daunting one. This fear alone might sometimes prompt extra vigilance. Conversely, there is the opposite risk. What if a stray draft fanned the banked embers? What if the ash covering was insufficient or disturbed? A banked fire, while subdued, still contained intense heat. There was always a small but terrifying possibility that it could flare back to life unexpectedly during the night, potentially igniting nearby flammable materials, the straw on the floor, wooden furnishings, or even the structure itself. Fear of house fire, ever present, might also encourage someone to keep a watchful eye. Beyond the fire itself, there was the constant battle against the cold air infiltrating the dwelling. While major repairs to the wattle and daub walls or thatch roof were daytime tasks, fierce winter winds could exploit existing weaknesses or create new ones overnight. A sudden gale might tear at the thatch, loosen a shutter, or force icy air through previously unnoticed cracks. Dealing with such sudden, intense drafts immediately could be crucial for maintaining a minimally tolerable temperature inside. In response to these anxieties, the fear of the fire dying, the fear of it flaring, the need to address sudden drafts, it is plausible to imagine that under certain extreme circumstances, families might have instituted a form of night watch. This wouldn't necessarily mean one person staying fully awake all night, an almost impossible feat after a day of hard labor. More likely, it involved family members taking turns to remain in a state of light sleep, easily roused, or waking periodically to check condition. This responsibility would likely fall to the adults or older, more responsible children in the household. It would be another shared burden, divided amongst those capable. Perhaps the husband and wife took turns, or an older son or daughter participated in the rotation. The goal was to ensure someone was always minimally alert, acting as the guardian of the household's warmth and safety through the darkest, coldest hours, while others slept more deeply nearby. The tasks of the designated watcher would be subtle, performed quietly to avoid disturbing the rest of the family. Their primary focus would be the banked hearth. Periodically, they might listen for the faint crackle that could signal an unwanted flare-up, or perhaps cautiously feel for residual warmth to ensure the embers hadn't died completely. Maybe they would gently adjust the ash covering if it seemed disturbed, using a stick with extreme care. Any intervention would be minimal, aimed at maintaining the status quo. Another key role would be attentiveness to drafts. The watcher, sitting or lying awake in the quiet darkness, would be acutely sensitive to changes in air movement. A sudden stream of colder air, the whistle of wind through a new gap, or the rattling of a loose door or shutter would alert them. They would try to pinpoint the source of the draft in the dim light filtering from the embers or moonlight. Once a significant draft was identified, the watcher might attempt a temporary fix. This wouldn't involve major repairs, but immediate stopgap measures. They might take handfuls of loose straw or rags, kept nearby perhaps for this purpose, and stuff them firmly into the offending crack or gap around a window hole or door frame. In truly severe conditions with driving snow, they might even use handfuls of snow itself as a temporary sealant against the wind. The aim was simply to block the worst of the cold air immediately. Staying even partially awake under such conditions would be incredibly difficult. The cold, the darkness, the lulling quiet, punctuated only by the wind or the breathing of sleeping family members, and the sheer physical exhaustion from the previous day's labor would all conspire to pull the watcher towards sleep. It would require significant willpower to remain alert, perhaps shifting position occasionally, rubbing hands together, focusing intently on sounds and sensations to fight off drowsiness. The watcher would likely perform their duties with minimal movement, conserving their own body heat and avoiding disturbing the others huddled nearby. They might sit propped up against a wall, wrapped tightly in their cloak or blanket, perhaps positioned strategically to observe the hearth and feel drafts from the most vulnerable parts of the hut. Their vigil was one of quiet observation and readiness, not active patrolling. Stillness was key. When their agreed-upon or judged time was over, the watcher would gently rouse the next person designated for the watch. This transition would happen in hushed tones with minimal disturbance, a quiet word, a gentle touch, conveying that the watch was changing hands. The relieved watcher could then finally succumb to deep sleep, while the new guardian took up their post, continuing the cycle of vigilance through the remainder of the night. The duration of these shifts would likely be informal, perhaps lasting a few hours each. Timekeeping was imprecise, often judged by the position of the stars, if visible through a smoke hole or crack, or simply by the watcher's own sense of duration and fatigue. The rotation would continue until the first hints of dawn signaled the end of the long night and the beginning of the process of fully reviving the fire for the day. It is important, however, to frame this night watch tactic appropriately. It was likely not a standard everyday practice in most peasant households during winter. The effectiveness of fire banking meant that usually everyone could sleep, trusting the embers to survive until morning. The night watch was probably reserved for the most extreme conditions, nights of exceptional cold, ferocious blizzards, or perhaps when anxieties about the fire or the house's integrity were particularly high for specific reasons. Think of it perhaps as an emergency measure, an extra layer of security deployed when the usual routines felt insufficient against the perceived level of threat from the elements or the fire itself. It supplemented, rather than replaced, the core practice of banking the fire. It represented heightened vigilance in response to heightened risk, a temporary escalation of effort when survival felt particularly precarious. Direct historical evidence, specifically detailing peasants organizing rotating night watches to tend fires or drafts, is scarce, if not entirely absent. Unlike agricultural practices or legal matters, The intimate details of nightly household routines, especially potentially infrequent emergency measures, were rarely recorded. Our understanding of this possibility comes from logical inference, knowing the vital importance of the fire, the real dangers it posed, the inadequacy of peasant housing, and the human capacity for vigilance in the face of perceived threats. Ethnographic parallels from other cultures living in harsh climates with basic shelter and reliance on fire might offer comparative insights, but applying them directly to medieval Europe requires caution. What we can say is that given the known conditions and risks, such a strategy is plausible and aligns with the general theme of constant, effortful adaptation required for winter survival. It fits the pattern of doing whatever was necessary, however difficult. The psychological dimension of such a watch is worth considering. For the sleeping members of the family, knowing that someone was awake and vigilant, guarding against the fire dying or flaring or blocking sudden drafts, could provide a profound sense of security. It might allow them to rest easier despite the cold and discomfort. For the person on watch, however, it represented a burden, the responsibility for the household's immediate safety, coupled with the discomfort of cold and enforced wakefulness. Furthermore, the practice of a rotating watch, even if quiet, would inevitably disturb the sleep of the entire household to some degree. The act of one person staying awake, potentially moving slightly, and the process of changing shifts, however hushed, would likely fragment the sleep of those nearby in the small shared space. This represents another trade-off, sacrificing the quality of collective sleep for the perceived benefit of continuous vigilance during particularly threatening nights. Consider the atmosphere within the hut during such a watch. The deep darkness, relieved only by the faintest glow from the ash-covered embers. The profound quiet, emphasizing the sound of the wind outside, the breathing of the sleepers, and the watcher's own heightened senses. The feeling of the persistent cold, perhaps slightly mitigated near the hearth but permeating the space. The sense of responsibility, of being the sole guardian while others rested, it paints a picture of quiet tension and endurance. This potential tactic, the night watch, underscores the relentless nature of the struggle against winter. Survival wasn't just about enduring the days, but also about successfully navigating the nights. It required foresight, banking the fire, communal effort, huddling, resourcefulness, heated stones, hay boxes, and potentially, during the worst times, this added layer of active vigilance, ensuring the fragile bubble of warmth and safety within the hut persisted until morning. In conclusion, while perhaps not a nightly routine for most, the concept of a family implementing a rotating night watch during severe winter weather offers a plausible glimpse into the lengths peasants might go to protect their vital hearth fire and the integrity of their shelter. Born from anxieties about the fire dying or flaring, or the sudden onslaught of drafts, this speculative practice represents an escalation of vigilance in extreme circumstances. It highlights the constant effort, the shared burdens, and the deep-seated need for security that characterized the medieval peasants' determined effort to survive the long, cold, and potentially dangerous winter nights. We have journeyed through the many layers of the medieval peasants' struggle against winter, from the walls of their homes to the clothes on their backs, the food in their bellies, and the very air they breathed. Yet focusing solely on individual households risks overlooking a crucial element of survival: the village community itself. Peasants did not exist in isolation. They were part of a close-knit social fabric, and during the harshest times, particularly the long, unforgiving winter, mutual aid and communal support often made the difference between endurance and catastrophe. Let your mind gently turn now to the interconnected lives within the medieval village and how neighbors helped each other face the cold. Medieval peasant villages were typically compact settlements, with houses clustered relatively close together, often surrounded by the open fields farmed collectively under the manorial system. This physical proximity fostered a high degree of social interaction and interdependence. Neighbors knew each other well, perhaps too well at times, sharing not just physical space but also agricultural rhythms, local customs, religious observances, and the common experience of subordination to the lord of the manor. Life was inherently communal. This interdependence, visible throughout the agricultural year in shared tasks like plowing, planting, and harvesting, became even more critical during winter, when heavy snows might isolate the village, when food stores dwindled, when illness struck, or when individual misfortune occurred. The community often represented the only available safety net. There was no formal state welfare system. Support came, if at all, from family, neighbors, the manor, or the parish church, primarily from within the village itself. One of the simplest, yet potentially most vital, forms of mutual aid was the informal practice of checking on neighbors. In the depths of winter, especially during prolonged cold snaps or heavy snow, families might make a point of seeing if elderly individuals living alone Widows with young children, the sick, or families known to be struggling were managing. A simple visit, a shouted greeting, or noticing if smoke failed to rise from a neighbor's smoke hole could be the first step in identifying distress and offering assistance. Perhaps the most iconic and essential form of mutual aid revolved around the hearth fire. As we've established, allowing the fire to die out completely was a significant setback. If a family's banked embers failed overnight, perhaps due to damp fuel or mishap, the quickest and most reliable way to restart the fire was to borrow live coals from a neighbor whose own fire was successfully rekindled. This involved taking a shovel, a sturdy pot shard, or a metal container, if owned, to a neighboring hut and carefully carrying back a scoop of glowing embers. This act of sharing fire was likely commonplace and understood as a fundamental reciprocal obligation. It required trust and cooperation. The household with the live fire shared a vital resource, understanding that they might need the same favor themselves another day. It prevented the laborious and uncertain process of using flint and steel in a cold, potentially damp hut, allowing the borrowing household to regain warmth and the ability to cook much more quickly. It was a small act, embodying the essential interdependence of village life. Beyond sharing embers, neighbors might offer more substantial aid in times of acute crisis. If a peasant hut became uninhabitable due to severe weather damage, perhaps a section of the thatch roof collapsing under heavy snow or a wall breached by wind, the displaced family couldn't simply check into a hotel. The immediate recourse was often to seek shelter with neighbors. This meant families sharing their already cramped single-room dwellings, adding more bodies to the communal sleeping huddle, further straining limited resources but providing essential, life-saving shelter. Sharing food or fuel was a more complex matter. While acts of charity certainly occurred, widespread sharing of carefully hoarded winter supplies was likely limited by the imperative of ensuring one's own family's survival. Peasants lived close to the margins, and sharing food could jeopardize their own ability to last until spring. However, in cases of extreme individual hardship within the village, neighbors might share small amounts. A handful of grain, a few dried beans, a bundle of gathered firewood, especially if there was a strong expectation of reciprocity or a close kinship tie. During times of widespread famine, often triggered by harvest failures the previous autumn and exacerbated by a long winter, individual neighborly sharing reached its limits. At such times, aid, if any, might come from higher authorities. The lord of the manor, motivated perhaps by a mix of paternalism and the desire to preserve his labor force, might distribute meager grain doles. The parish church, too, might attempt some form of organized relief, funded by tithes or charitable bequests, though its resources were often limited. Certain essential winter tasks often required collective effort. If deep snow blocked paths within the village or access to the vital water source, a well or a stream, the able-bodied men of the village might work together to clear a way. Repairing communal fences damaged by winter storms or ensuring drainage ditches didn't freeze and cause flooding during thaws were other tasks potentially undertaken collectively for the common good, organized perhaps through the manorial court or informal agreement. Knowledge itself was a shared resource. Experienced elders might advise younger families on the best ways to bank a fire, how to identify safe edible roots or berries during a lean period, traditional remedies for winter ailments or interpreting weather signs. Skills like basic repairs to tools, walls, or roofs could be shared or taught. This informal transmission of practical knowledge and survival lore within the community was another crucial form of mutual support, enhancing collective resilience. These various acts of mutual aid, both small and large, did more than just address immediate physical needs. They reinforced the social bonds within the village, strengthening the sense of community and shared fate. Knowing that neighbors might help in a crisis and participating in helping others fostered a sense of belonging and reduced the psychological burden of facing the harsh winter entirely alone. These reciprocal relationships were the glue holding the village community together. The role of the manor in winter survival was often ambivalent. While the lord had an interest in his workforce surviving, his demands for rent, often paid in kind with produce, and labor services continued throughout the year, potentially depleting peasant resources needed for winter. Manorial justice could also be harsh. However, the manor structure did provide a framework for village organization and, as mentioned, might offer minimal relief in times of severe, widespread crisis that threatened the manor's own viability. The local parish church often served as a focal point for the community year-round and potentially played a role in winter support. The parish priest might be aware of families in distress and could encourage charity among parishioners. Church festivals or ales, community gatherings involving brewed ale, often held to raise funds for the church, could sometimes include charitable elements, distributing food or drink to the needy. The church also provided spiritual comfort and rituals that helped communities cope with hardship and loss. However, we must not romanticize village solidarity. Medieval village life was also characterized by social hierarchies, long-standing family feuds, disputes over land or resources adjudicated in the manor court, and accusations of witchcraft or other perceived wrongdoings. Mutual aid might not be extended equally to all. Those on the margins of village society, newcomers, or those who had fallen foul of powerful neighbors might find themselves excluded from the networks of support, making their winter survival even more precarious. Individuals without strong family connections within the village were particularly vulnerable: orphans, the elderly without children to support them, or individuals incapacitated by chronic illness or disability relied heavily on the goodwill of neighbors or the limited charity dispensed by the manor or church. Without the automatic support structure of a family unit integrated into the village's reciprocal networks, their situation could be extremely fragile, especially during the lean, cold months. Winter naturally amplified existing vulnerabilities. The cold itself could weaken the sick or elderly. Immobility due to snow or ice could prevent people from gathering fuel, fetching water, or seeking aid. Dwindling food supplies increased desperation and potential conflict. The shorter days and long nights could foster fear and superstition. In this context, the networks of mutual support, however imperfect, became even more critical lifelines than during the more abundant seasons of the year. Evidence for these communal ties and mutual aid practices comes from various sources. Manorial court records often document community cooperation, e.g., agreements on managing common resources, but also conflicts that reveal social dynamics. Archaeological excavations showing the close layout of village houses and shared spaces point to an interconnected existence. Written accounts, though often biased towards elite perspectives, sometimes describe village life. Furthermore, parallels with peasant societies and other historical periods and regions often show similar patterns of mutual reliance. The psychological benefit of community should not be underestimated. Facing the hardships of a medieval winter, the cold, the hunger, the darkness, the fear of illness or misfortune, would be infinitely harder in isolation. Knowing that one belonged to a community, that neighbors shared the same struggles, and that help might be forthcoming in a crisis provided a crucial buffer against despair. It fostered a sense of collective endurance, a belief that together the community could weather the storm. Imagine the difference: an isolated peasant family facing a collapsed roof or a dead hearth alone versus a family in a village who could immediately turn to neighbors for temporary shelter or life-giving embers. The village structure provided redundancy and resilience that individual homesteads lacked. Survival was often fundamentally a team effort, played out at the village level. This system of mutual aid was built on a foundation of reciprocity. Helping a neighbor today created an expectation, a social obligation, that they would help you tomorrow if your situations were reversed. This ongoing cycle of giving and receiving assistance, even in small ways, was essential for maintaining social cohesion and ensuring the long-term viability of the community. Breaking these unwritten rules could lead to social exclusion, a dangerous prospect in such an interdependent world. In conclusion, while individual resilience and household strategies were the first line of defense against the medieval winter, the village community provided a vital second layer of support. Through informal practices like checking on neighbors, sharing fire embers, offering temporary shelter, and sometimes pooling resources or labor, peasants collectively navigated the challenges of the cold season. This network of mutual aid, born of necessity and sustained by reciprocity, was fundamental to survival, demonstrating that even in the harshest conditions, community bonds offered warmth, strength, and a measure of security against the indifference of winter. We have explored the physical world of the medieval peasant in winter, their homes, their clothes, their food, their communal efforts. But human beings do not live by bread and shelter alone, especially when facing hardship. When practical measures reached their limits, when the cold seemed insurmountable and misfortune struck, medieval peasants turned to another realm for solace and strength, the realm of faith and belief. Tonight, let us gently consider the role of prayer and superstition in navigating the anxieties and dangers of the winter season. Settle comfortably, breathe slowly and deeply, and let your mind drift towards these intangible aspects of survival. Religion, predominantly Christianity, in medieval Europe, was not a separate compartment of life. It permeated every aspect of existence. The rhythm of the day might be marked by church bells, the year punctuated by religious feast days and fasting periods. Belief in God, the teachings of the church, the lives of the saints, and the reality of heaven, hell, and purgatory shaped the worldview of peasant and lord alike. Faith provided a framework for understanding the world, suffering, and one's place within a divine order. Winter, with its inherent challenges, the biting cold, the threat of hunger as stores dwindled, the increased prevalence of sickness, the long, oppressive darkness, could easily be interpreted within this religious framework. Hardships might be seen as trials sent by God to test faith, as consequences of individual or collective sin, or simply as part of the difficult reality of earthly existence after the fall. This perspective, while perhaps bleak, offered an explanation, a sense of meaning beyond mere random suffering. In the face of these trials, prayer was a fundamental coping mechanism. It was a direct line of communication, a way to appeal for divine assistance, express anxieties, seek forgiveness, and find solace. When human effort felt insufficient against the overwhelming forces of nature, prayer offered a way to seek intervention from a higher power believed to control those forces. It was an act of hope and dependence in a world fraught with uncertainty, especially during the vulnerable winter months. Specific prayers would undoubtedly address the immediate threats of winter. Peasants might pray earnestly for protection from the lethal cold, asking God or favored saints to temper the winds, to keep their meager shelters intact against storms, or to bless their banked hearth fire so its precious embers would not die out overnight. Praying for physical warmth, for the basic necessity of shelter, was likely a common theme in the quiet vespers of a peasant family huddled together as darkness fell. Illness was a constant fear, exacerbated by the cold, damp conditions and close living quarters of winter. Prayers for health would have been fervent. Peasants would petition God for protection against the coughs, fevers, lung ailments, the various sicknesses that could sweep through a village. If illness did strike a family member, prayers for healing, perhaps directed towards saints renowned for cures like Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian, would be offered with desperate hope at the bedside or the village church. As winter progressed and stored food supplies inevitably diminished, anxiety about sustenance grew. Prayers would turn towards the preservation of food, asking for blessings on the remaining grain, dried beans, or salted meat, that it might last until the lean, hungry gap of late winter and early spring had passed. In times of true famine, prayers for deliverance, for some unexpected source of food, or for the strength to endure hunger, would rise from desperate hearts. Safety was another major concern. Peasants might pray for protection from accidents related to the winter environment, slipping on ice, being caught in a sudden blizzard, or the ever-present danger of a house fire from the essential hearth. They might also pray for protection against wild animals, like wolves, driven closer to human settlements by hunger during harsh winter. The long nights could also heighten fears of supernatural dangers, leading to prayers for protection against evil spirits or ill fortune perceived to lurk in the darkness. Beyond direct prayer to God, the veneration of saints played a significant role in popular piety. Saints were seen as powerful intercessors, more approachable perhaps than God himself, who could plead a petitioner's case in heaven. Peasants might have particular devotion to saints associated with their locality, their trade, or specific needs, perhaps a saint associated with hearth and home, like Saint Bridget in some traditions, or saints known for protecting against storms, famine, or disease. Lighting a candle or making a small offering at the church in a saint's name accompanied these prayers. Alongside formal Christian beliefs, older folk traditions and superstitions often coexisted, blending seamlessly in the popular imagination. These beliefs offered additional ways to try and influence or appease the forces, seen and unseen, that shaped their lives. Winter, with its long darkness and heightened sense of vulnerability, was a time when such beliefs might feel particularly relevant, offering extra layers of perceived protection or ways to avoid bad luck. The hearth, being so central to survival, was often a focus of such beliefs. While specific superstitions varied greatly by region and time, one can imagine beliefs about actions that might harm or protect the fire's luck. Perhaps certain types of wood were considered unlucky to burn, or maybe throwing specific offerings like salt or milk into the embers was thought to appease household spirits or ensure the fire lasted. Keeping the hearth area clean might have been seen not just as practical, but as necessary to avoid offending protective spirits. Simple rituals or charms aimed at protecting the home might also have been employed, marking a cross on the doorframe with chalk, hanging bunches of specific herbs believed to ward off evil, or observing certain taboos about bringing particular objects indoors during winter. These practices offered a sense of actively doing something to shield the household from unseen threats, whether perceived as demonic forces, bad luck, or the negative influences associated with the dead season. Whether through formal prayer or folk superstition, these beliefs provided crucial psychological comfort. In a world where life often felt precarious and subject to inexplicable misfortune, faith and ritual offered a sense of agency, a way to feel involved in shaping one's fate. They provided explanations for hardship and offered hope for deliverance or endurance. Believing that one had sought divine aid or taken protective measures could significantly reduce anxiety and foster the mental resilience needed to face adversity. The communal aspects of faith were also important. Attending Mass in the often cold village church, participating in religious processions, or celebrating major winter feast days like Christmas or Candlemas provided shared rituals that reinforced community bonds and offered collective expressions of hope and faith. These gatherings provided opportunities for shared prayer, mutual support, and a reminder that they were all part of a larger spiritual community facing the winter together. Ultimately, faith and superstition were deeply woven into the fabric of the medieval peasants' winter experience. They were not separate from practical survival tactics but complemented them, offering intangible resources when physical ones were strained. Prayer provided solace and hope, while folk beliefs offered additional perceived layers of protection and control. Together, they formed a vital part of the psychological toolkit that helped individuals and communities endure the darkness, cold, and uncertainty, holding on to the belief in eventual renewal in the coming of spring. Throughout our journey into the medieval peasants' winter, we have explored a remarkable array of tactics for survival, from layering clothes and huddling for warmth to banking fires, seeking communal aid, and finding solace in faith. Peasants employed considerable ingenuity and resilience against the cold season. Yet we must now turn to a more somber reality, a truth that underscores the precariousness of their existence. Sometimes, despite all efforts, winter won. Tonight, let us reflect quietly on the harsh consequences when tactics failed, when the cold, hunger, or sickness proved overwhelming. Allow your mind to gently acknowledge this difficult aspect of the past. The adversary faced by the medieval peasant each winter was formidable. We speak not merely of inconvenience or discomfort, but often of lethal conditions. Extreme cold far below freezing, lasting for weeks or months, blizzards that could bury homes and block paths, dwindling food supplies, the pervasive damp and darkness, these were powerful forces. The simple technologies and limited resources available offered only a fragile defense against the full might of an unforgiving medieval winter. Human ingenuity could only achieve so much. One direct way winter claimed lives was through cold itself. Despite woolen layers, shared body heat, and perhaps a heated stone, prolonged exposure, especially for the very young, the elderly, or those weakened by illness or hunger, could lead to fatal hypothermia. If clothing became soaked through from melting snow or rain and couldn't be dried, its insulating properties plummeted. If someone became lost or injured outdoors, or if the shelter itself failed catastrophically, the cold could overwhelm the body's ability to maintain its core temperature. Death from exposure was a grim possibility. Starvation was another relentless threat, particularly in the later winter months. The previous autumn's harvest had to sustain the family until the next growing season produced results. If the harvest had been poor due to bad weather, blight, or the demands of the manor, stored food supplies might simply run out before spring arrived. This dreaded period, the hungry gap, saw families reduced to foraging for anything edible, consuming seed grain needed for planting, or slowly succumbing to the weakness and deficiency diseases caused by chronic malnutrition. For some, sustenance simply ceased. Closely linked to cold and malnutrition was the heightened risk of illness. Respiratory diseases like pneumonia and bronchitis thrived in the cold, damp conditions and spread rapidly within crowded, poorly ventilated huts filled with smoke. Influenza could sweep through villages. Weakened immune systems, compromised by poor diet and constant environmental stress, offered little resistance. Without effective medicines or understanding of germ theory, common winter ailments could easily prove fatal, especially for children and the elderly, turning coughs and fevers into death sentences. Accidents, too, contributed to winter mortality. The essential hearth fire, source of life, was also a source of danger. A moment's carelessness, a sudden draft, or structural failure could lead to devastating house fires, trapping inhabitants within the flammable timber and thatched structures. Roofs, burdened by heavy snow or weakened by rot, could collapse. Gathering firewood on icy slopes or venturing out in poor visibility could lead to falls and injuries that might prove fatal without proper medical care. Winter multiplied everyday hazards. The loss of even a single individual could have a profound impact on a peasant family. Beyond the immediate grief and emotional devastation, losing an able-bodied adult meant the loss of essential labor for farming, gathering fuel, or performing other tasks necessary for the household survival. Losing a mother jeopardized childcare and household management. The death of any member shifted the delicate balance of the family economy, increasing the burden on the survivors and potentially making their own survival more precarious. Sometimes, tragedy struck not just individuals but entire family units. Infectious diseases could spread rapidly through those huddled together for warmth, potentially claiming multiple lives within days or weeks. Severe starvation could weaken everyone, leading to a cascade of deaths. Imagine the desolation of a hut falling silent, its occupants lost to cold, sickness, or hunger, leaving behind only the chilling emptiness where a family once lived and struggled together. The loss of children, so common in this era, was a recurring heartbreak. On a larger scale, entire villages could be severely impacted. A widespread famine following successive harvest failures, or a particularly virulent epidemic sweeping through during the vulnerable winter months, could lead to a significant decline in the village population. While the complete abandonment of a village solely due to one bad winter was likely rare, severe winters could contribute to the gradual decline or eventual desertion of marginal settlements already struggling with poor soil or other disadvantages. The collective resilience had its limits. Often, these factors compounded each other in a vicious cycle. Malnutrition weakened the body's resistance to cold and disease. Illness prevented individuals from working to obtain food or fuel, deepening their poverty and hunger. Exposure to cold exacerbated respiratory conditions. A single misfortune, like a fire destroying a family's meager grain store, could trigger a downward spiral leading to starvation or susceptibility to disease. Failure rarely occurred in isolation. It was often a convergence of hardships. The period stretching from late winter into early spring, the Hungry Gap, was often the time of greatest mortality. Food stores were at their lowest, the cumulative effects of winter hardship had weakened bodies, and the weather could still be treacherously cold and damp. The hope of spring's arrival was tempered by the immediate reality of scarcity and vulnerability. This was the period when the struggle for survival reached its most critical point for many peasant families. We must remember the limited nature of external support. While neighbors might offer aid, their own resources were finite. Manorial or church charity was often minimal and insufficient during widespread crises. There was no state-funded safety net, no emergency food distribution network as we know it today. Families and communities facing overwhelming hardship were largely left to fend for themselves, and sometimes their collective resources simply weren't enough to prevent tragedy. Archaeological evidence offers silent testimony to these grim realities. Analysis of skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries often reveals signs of chronic malnutrition, arrested growth during childhood, Paris lines, high rates of infant and child mortality, and evidence of diseases like tuberculosis or leprosy, all of which would have increased winter vulnerability. Patterns in burials might sometimes suggest periods of increased mortality corresponding to known famines or epidemics. Abandoned village sites speak to ultimate community failure, though often due to multiple long-term factors. Historical records, though often incomplete or focused on elite concerns, also document the impact of harsh winters. Chronicles might mention severe famines, widespread plagues, which could be devastating regardless of season but hit weakened populations hard, or unusually long and cold winters that caused widespread suffering. Tax records might show population declines in certain regions after particularly difficult periods. These fragments paint a picture of winter as a recurring threat to demographic stability. The psychological toll of witnessing such loss year after year must have been immense. Seeing neighbors, friends, or one's own family members succumb to cold, hunger, or disease inevitably fostered grief, fear, and perhaps a sense of fatalism. Coping with recurring bereavement, especially the common loss of children, required immense emotional resilience. Yet, somehow, communities absorbed these losses and found ways to continue. Religious faith and communal rituals provided important frameworks for processing grief. Funerals, however simple, offered a structured way to acknowledge loss and affirm beliefs about the afterlife. Communal mourning allowed shared expression of sorrow. Feast days and religious services provided moments of collective hope and reaffirmed the social bonds that helped survivors carry on. Faith offered solace, explanation, and the promise of eventual reunion in the next life. Despite the grim reality of winter mortality, it is also crucial to acknowledge the incredible resilience of medieval peasant communities. Losses were mourned, but life went on. Fields were replanted, families reformed, communities adapted. The cycle of seasons brought renewal as well as hardship. The fact that these communities endured for centuries, despite facing such challenges regularly, speaks volumes about their inherent toughness and adaptability. Loss was part of their rhythm, but so was continuity. Winter in this context acted as a harsh filter, a period of intense natural selection where the weakest, the unluckiest, or those with the fewest resources were most likely to perish. It shaped the population, favoring resilience and strong community bonds. While tragic for the individuals involved, this recurring pressure likely contributed to the long-term survival strategies and social structures that characterized medieval rural life. It is sobering to contrast this historical reality with our modern experience in many parts of the world. Central heating, advanced medicine, reliable food distribution networks, and social safety nets have largely insulated us from the direct threats of winter mortality that were commonplace for medieval peasants. While winter still presents challenges, its power to cause widespread death from cold, hunger, or related illness has been drastically curtailed by technology and social organization. In conclusion, as we reflect on the myriad tactics peasants employed to survive the winter, we must also hold space for the somber truth that these efforts were not always successful. Winter remained a formidable adversary, capable of claiming lives through cold, starvation, illness, and accident. Loss was an intrinsic, though deeply painful, part of the seasonal cycle for medieval peasant families and communities. Acknowledging this reality does not diminish their resilience or ingenuity. Rather, it underscores the truly challenging nature of the world they inhabited, and the profound value they must have placed on warmth, sustenance, and the simple continuation of life until the return of spring. Our journey through the landscape of the medieval peasant's winter now draws to a close. We have walked through the drafty homes, felt the pervasive chill, huddled near the smoky hearth, considered the layers of rough clothing, and explored the strategies, both tangible and intangible, employed in the face of profound hardship. As we conclude this exploration, let us take a moment to reflect on the quiet legacy of those who endured. A legacy not of grand monuments, but of incredible resilience and adaptation, etched into the very fabric of human history. Let your mind rest now, absorbing the echoes of their endurance. We have seen how survival depended on a multi-layered approach. It began with the dwelling itself, however inadequate, the wattle and daub walls, the thatched roof, the earth floor. It centered on the vital hearth fire, managed through careful banking or perhaps in dire times, watchful shifts. It involved layering every available garment, relying on the natural warmth of wool. Perhaps even inadvertently aided by accumulated grime, it meant seeking warmth in numbers, huddling together through the long nights, sharing precious body heat. We considered the fuel needed from within, the heavy, calorie-dense evening meals designed to stoke the internal furnace through the slow process of digestion. We touched upon the ingenuity of simple tools like heated stones offering localized warmth in cold beds, and hay boxes preserving precious heat in cooked food, saving fuel and extending sustenance. We even pondered the subtle, perhaps instinctual adjustments in breathing to temper the shock of icy air, and the crucial reliance on neighbors for mutual aid, sharing embers, shelter, and support. And finally, we acknowledged the role of the intangible, the solace found in faith, the hope offered through prayer to God and saints, and the additional perceived protection sought through folk beliefs and superstitions surrounding the home and hearth. All these elements, from the most practical to the most spiritual, formed the complex tapestry of peasant winter survival tactics. There was no single magic solution, only a constant, effortful combination of strategies. What stands out most profoundly is the resourcefulness demonstrated time and again, using only the simplest materials at hand: wood, mud, straw, stones, wool, farm animals. The heat of digestion, the strength of community, these were the core components of their survival kit. There was an ingenuity born of necessity, an understanding of basic principles like insulation and heat retention learned through generations of lived experience and observation, long before scientific formulas could explain them. Let us not, however, romanticize this struggle. As we acknowledged, these tactics were often insufficient. Winter remained a time of immense hardship, pervasive discomfort, and very real danger. Cold, hunger, and illness were constant companions, and death was a frequent visitor. The resilience we admire was forged in the crucible of genuine suffering and loss. Their endurance is remarkable precisely because the challenges they faced were so daunting. Yet, endure they did, generation after generation. This capacity to face recurring hardship, to wake each morning in the cold and damp and resume the tasks necessary for survival, speaks to an incredible grit, a deep wellspring of human perseverance. It was not a life of grand gestures, but one defined by the quiet, relentless determination to simply make it through another day, another winter, until the eventual return of the sun's warmth and the renewal of the land in spring. Their ingenuity, too, deserves quiet appreciation, finding ways to make a drafty hut slightly more tolerable, to keep embers alive overnight, to stretch meager food supplies, to extract warmth from stones or preserve it with hay. These were small but significant triumphs of human adaptation. They demonstrate the ability to observe, experiment, and refine techniques using only what the immediate environment provided, turning limitations into opportunities for clever solutions. And perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us of the fundamental strength found in community. In a world without extensive external support systems, the village itself, the network of neighbors bound by shared experience and reciprocal obligations, was a critical buffer against disaster. Sharing fire, offering shelter, checking on the vulnerable, these acts of mutual aid were not just kindnesses, They were essential components of collective survival. Resilience was rarely solitary, it was woven into the social fabric. In contemplating their lives, we glimpse a profound, if often challenging, connection to the natural world. Their survival depended on an intimate understanding of the seasons, the properties of local materials, the behavior of fire, the needs of livestock, and the limits of their own bodies against the elements. It was a relationship built less on dominance and more on careful negotiation and adaptation to forces far greater than themselves. As we drift towards sleep, perhaps the legacy of these medieval peasants offers a quiet perspective. It speaks to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It highlights the value of simple things, warmth, food, shelter, community, that we might sometimes take for granted. It reminds us that resilience can be found not just in grand achievements, but in the quiet, persistent effort of everyday life, in adapting, enduring, and helping one another through difficult times. Their survival was not just about enduring hardship, it was the necessary thread connecting the past to the future. These unnamed millions who successfully navigated the challenges of countless winters were the ancestors of many who came after. Their perseverance, their ability to raise families and maintain communities despite the odds, allowed for the continuity of life, the slow accumulation of knowledge, and the eventual development of societies less vulnerable to the raw power of the seasons. We exist, in part, because they endured. So let us leave them there, in the quiet darkness of their winter huts, resting after their long struggle. Remember their resilience, their resourcefulness, their reliance on each other. Let their story be not one of misery alone, but a testament to the quiet, enduring strength found in facing hardship with practicality, ingenuity, and community spirit. May this reflection on their endurance bring a sense of calm, perspective, and peace as you now settle into your own comfortable rest. Sleep well. And so, our exploration of the medieval peasants' quiet battle against the winter chill comes to an end. We leave behind the smoky huts and frosty fields, carrying with us images of resilience and simple ingenuity. But the human story of adaptation is vast, spanning millennia and continents. Let us now gently shift our focus much further back in time and journey to a vastly different landscape, the arid desert coast of Peru, to uncover the secrets of Caral, one of the most ancient cities in the Americas, and learn how its people navigated the challenges of their unique world. Let the mists of medieval Europe dissolve from your mind, replaced now by the dry, sun-baked landscapes of coastal Peru. We travel back much further in time, peeling away layers of history not just by centuries but by millennia. Our destination is a place of profound antiquity, a testament to human civilization rising independently in the Americas, the sacred city of Carasupe. Prepare to journey to a time nearly 5,000 years ago to explore the monumental ruins of a civilization that flourished long before the Incas, even predating the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. Let the desert sands replace the muddy fields in your thoughts. Imagine a barren, arid river valley carved through the coastal desert plain of Peru, the Supe Valley. About 14 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean, nestled on a dry terrace overlooking the green ribbon of the Supe River below, lies the sprawling archaeological site of Caral. This was not a small village, but a large, complex urban center covering over 150 acres, representing one of the earliest and most significant flowerings of civilization in the Americas. Its scale and age challenge long-held notions about the development of societies in the New World. Izhuacal emerged around 3000 BCE, flourishing for perhaps 1,000 years, roughly contemporaneously with the pyramid-building Old Kingdom in Egypt and the rise of Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia. Yet it developed in remarkable isolation from these old-world centers, creating its own unique path towards social complexity, large-scale architecture, and sophisticated societal organization. It stands as the heart of what archaeologists call the Norchico civilization, a constellation of related sites in the region that represent the oldest known civilization in the Americas. For centuries, the significance of Caral lay hidden beneath layers of sand and neglect. While local inhabitants knew of the mounds, systematic archaeological investigation only began in earnest in the 9990s, led by Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solas. Her meticulous work, continuing to this day, has gradually unveiled the true scale, complexity, and astonishing age of the site, rewriting the timeline of Andean civilization and offering profound insights into the origins of urban life in this part of the world. The city itself is dominated by impressive public and ceremonial structures. Imagine large earth and stone platform mounds, often referred to as pyramids, though different in construction and perhaps function from their Egyptian counterparts. 6 major pyramids punctuate the landscape of Caral, arranged around vast open plazas. These structures, built using quarried stone and river cobbles carried in reed bags called shikras, represent enormous investments of coordinated labor, hinting at a powerful social hierarchy and shared ideology. The largest of these structures is the pyramid mire, rising some 60 feet high and covering an area nearly the size of 4 football fields. Ascending its ramps and staircases would have led to temples and ceremonial chambers at the summit, offering commanding views over the city and the surrounding valley. The sheer effort involved in constructing such monuments using only basic tools and human labor speaks volumes about the organizational capacity and shared purpose of Carral's inhabitants nearly 5 millennia ago. Another distinctive feature of Carral, found associated with its major pyramids and plazas, are the sunken circular courts. These large, round, subterranean plazas, typically ranging from 20 to 40 meters in diameter and several meters deep, were accessed by stairways. Their precise function remains debated, but they likely served as important ceremonial or social gathering spaces, perhaps related to astronomical observations, water rituals, or community assemblies. Their careful construction and recurring presence across the site underscore their significance in Carral's urban design and ritual life. Beyond the major pyramids and sunken courts, the site includes numerous smaller temples, elite residential complexes, workshops, and simpler dwellings. The layout suggests a planned city, possibly divided into sectors based on function or social standing. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of specialized craft production, including textiles made from cotton, intricate ornaments fashioned from shells and bone, and musical instruments like flutes made from condor and pelican bones, hinting at a vibrant cultural and economic life. One of the most intriguing aspects of Carral is the apparent lack of defensive structures or evidence of warfare. Unlike many ancient cities around the world, Carral seems to have no fortifications and finds of weapons are rare. This has led some researchers to characterize Carral and the North Chico civilization as remarkably peaceful, perhaps focused more on trade, agriculture, and religious observance than on conflict. This apparent pacifism, if accurate, makes its rise and thousand-year duration even more fascinating. The city's location in the arid Soup Valley raises questions about sustenance. While the river provided a source of water, agriculture on the dry terraces required sophisticated irrigation systems. Excavations suggest Carral's inhabitants cultivated crops like squash, beans, lucuma fruit, and crucially cotton. This cotton was not just used for textiles, but may have been a key trade commodity exchanged with coastal communities for fish, shellfish, and other marine resources that formed a significant part of the Carral diet. As has been revealed, this proposed interdependence between inland agricultural centers like Carral and fishing settlements along the nearby Pacific coast suggests a complex regional economy. Carral, with its monumental architecture and ceremonial focus, may have served as the central hub, coordinating agricultural production, religious activities, and trade networks that extended throughout the Supe Valley and potentially beyond, linking the resources of the Andes foothills, the river valley, and the ocean. The sophistication of Carral extends beyond architecture and economy. Evidence suggests a deep understanding of astronomy and calendrics, possibly linked to the sunken circular courts and the precise alignment of certain structures. The discovery of quipus, knotted string recording devices later used famously by the Incas, pushes back the known history of this Andean information technology by thousands of years, suggesting complex record-keeping was already underway in this early period. The musical instruments found at Carral, particularly the beautifully crafted flutes made from animal bones, hint at the importance of music in their ceremonial life. Imagine the sounds echoing across the plazas during rituals, the haunting melodies of the flutes, perhaps accompanied by rattles or drums, creating an atmosphere of sacred performance within the monumental setting of the pyramids and sunken courts. Music seems to have been an integral part of Carral's cultural expression. Why did Carral eventually decline? Around 1800 BCE, after more than a millennium of apparent stability, the city seems to have been abandoned. The exact reasons remain unclear, but potential factors include climate change, perhaps prolonged droughts or seismic activity affecting the crucial irrigation systems, internal social stresses, or shifts in regional power dynamics. Whatever the cause, the Great Pyramids fell silent, and the desert sands gradually reclaimed the once thriving city. The rediscovery and ongoing excavation of Carral have fundamentally altered our understanding of ancient Peru and the emergence of civilization in the Americas. It demonstrates that large-scale urbanism, monumental architecture, complex social organization, and sophisticated cultural practices arose far earlier and potentially more peacefully than previously thought. Carral stands as a unique American genesis, a counterpart to the ancient river valley civilizations of the Old World. Imagine walking through the site today. The scale is still impressive. The bleached stone and earth structures rise against the backdrop of the arid hills and the narrow strip of green along the river. Standing in the vast central plaza or looking down into a sunken circular court, one feels the immense weight of time. Nearly 5,000 years separate us from the people who built and inhabited this place, yet their legacy endures in these monumental ruins. The dry desert air has helped preserve organic materials rarely found at other ancient sites, giving archaeologists precious glimpses into daily life. The remnants of cotton nets and textiles, the plant remains from their diet, the simple tools they used. These small details help bring the builders of the pyramids to life, reminding us that this vast complex was once home to thousands of individuals, living out their lives, pursuing their beliefs, and contributing to this remarkable early civilization. Many questions about Caral remain unanswered. What was the precise nature of their political system? How was labor mobilized for the massive construction project? What were the specifics of their religious beliefs and rituals performed in the temples and courts? Why did they eventually abandon this magnificent city? Ongoing research continues to shed light on these mysteries, piecing together the story of this ancient metropolis. The preservation challenges are also significant. Protecting this vast, fragile site from erosion, weathering, potential looting, and the pressures of modern development requires constant effort. Ensuring that Caral survives for future generations to study and appreciate is a crucial task. Safeguarding this unique window into the dawn of Andean civilization and a pivotal chapter in the human story of urbanization. Caral's existence highlights the diversity of pathways to civilization. Unlike many old-world counterparts heavily reliant on pottery or extensive warfare, Caral developed its complexity based on irrigated agriculture, especially cotton, maritime trade, monumental ceremonial architecture, and perhaps a unique social or political structure that emphasized communal ritual and regional cooperation over conflict. It offers a different model for how early cities could emerge and function. As we begin our deeper exploration of this ancient site, let the sheer age and scale settle into your mind. 5 millennia ago, while Egypt was building its first pyramids, a sophisticated society here in coastal Peru was constructing its own monumental landscape, organizing large populations, developing complex economies, and creating a vibrant culture. Caral invites us to broaden our perspective on the ancient world, to appreciate the independent achievements of early American peoples. Imagine the quiet stillness of the site now, under the stars of the southern hemisphere. The wind whispers through the ruins, carrying echoes of ancient chants, the murmur of crowds in the plazas, the sounds of construction. We are about to delve into the heart of this enigma, to explore what life might have been like in one of the world's oldest cities, a place lost to time for centuries, now re-emerging to tell its extraordinary story. Let the journey into Caral begin. And so, our quiet explorations draw to a peaceful close. We have journeyed together through the biting cold of medieval winters, witnessing the quiet grit and resourcefulness of peasants facing the elements. We may have even traveled further still, back across millennia to glimpse the ancient, sun-baked stones of Caral, sensing the echoes of another time, another struggle, another form of human endurance. Let these stories now gently fade into the background of your mind. The thread that runs through these diverse histories, spanning centuries and continents, is one of quiet resilience. It is the story of ordinary people adapting to their world, using the knowledge and materials available to them, finding ways to endure, to protect their families, to maintain their communities, and to simply continue. From the banked hearth fire and woolen cloaks of Europe to the irrigated fields and monumental plazas of ancient Peru, the human spirit finds ways to persist. These narratives of survival, of ingenuity born from necessity, are not meant to trouble your thoughts, but perhaps to offer a gentle sense of perspective. They remind us of the fundamental human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find strength even in challenging circumstances. There is a deep comfort to be found in understanding this continuity, this quiet, unwavering perseverance that forms the bedrock of our shared human story. Let that sense of enduring strength soothe you now. Allow the details of history to soften and blur. Let go of the specific facts and figures, the names and dates. Allow yourself now to simply float on the feeling of calm that follows these stories. Feel the weight of your body relaxing, your muscles softening, your mind letting go of the day's concerns. Just like those who endured long winters sought rest, allow yourself now the deep, restorative peace of sleep. You have journeyed far enough for tonight. Thank you for joining us on this quiet exploration of the past. We hope these stories have provided a gentle pathway towards relaxation and tranquility. May your own night be peaceful, warm, and secure. May you find comfort in the quiet darkness, and may your sleep be deep and truly restful. Until next time, rest well. Good night.